Good evening, everyone. This is the time and place set for the special Royal Oak Planning Commission Master Plan Town Hall meeting, the first part of a two-part meeting. And we're going to call the meeting to order. At this time, we're going to ask people to introduce themselves, starting way over there behind Mr. Gordon.
My name is Alex Gaworski. I'm with the City Planning Department.
Joseph Murphy, Director of Planning.
Matt Lambert, primary. There we are. Matt Lambert, DPZ Co-Design.
Paul Erbiel from McKenna.
Charlene Douglas, City Commissioner.
Josh Markham, City Attorney's Office.
Woody Gantino.
Jim Allison.
Clyde Esbury.
And I'm Gary Casada. I'm the chairperson. This is a little bit of a different format tonight, as you probably know. And I'm going to start by asking Mr. Murphy to sort of introduce us to what we're doing here.
Certainly. I'll give you a brief overview of where we've been, where we're at, where we're headed. So state law requires municipalities to review their master plans every 5 years to determine whether they still meet the goals and objectives of the city's physical development, whether they need to be amended, or whether they should be scrapped and a new entire master plan be created. So in 2021, in August of 2021, the Planning Commission determined that the master plan's existing demographics, goals, objectives, future land use map, and recommended actions were no longer applicable or relevant to the way the city was physically developing. So there was a motion adopted to commence the process for us to retain a consultant to create a new master plan. And in 2022, we went through solicitation and interview process, and the contract was awarded to DPZ Co-Design of Florida. Matt Lambert is from DPZ. Now, DPZ started in 2022 doing field work, data analysis, and preparing for the public engagement component of the document. In 2023, we had a robust amount of public engagement, which included surveys at two very different stages of the process of creating a new document. We held meetings in neighborhoods, we had a week-long charrette, and we held meetings with businesses to gather their thoughts as well. And DPZ started to create a suggested format forward based on the culmination of that data analysis, public input, and their professional opinion. The Planning Commission did study that throughout 2023, and we moved forward to 2024, in which the Planning Commission continued its review. And in June, we received the draft that you have in front of you that's been reviewed by everyone in the public. Planning Commission did decide to hold this town hall forum tonight in order to obtain questions and provide answers to the public's questions about specific provisions or items in the draft document. So that's what we'll be approaching tonight. Future steps include further refinement of the document until the Planning Commission and the City Commission identify a refined version and accept it as the proposed master plan. And that's a term that's used under the state legislation. Once we have a proposed master plan, then we have to comply with a state requirement in which we send notice of that proposed master plan to different entities identified in the State Act, and those include our adjacent neighbors, the county, transportation system, railroad, and public utilities. They have a 63-day comment period in which they can provide comments back to you on that proposed master plan. After that 63-day period ends, the Planning Commission is required under the State Act to hold at least one public hearing on the document. Once you do that, arguably you'll refine it further and you'll get to the point where you adopt it as the master plan. It then has to go to the City Commission and they must concur with it. So tonight, the suggested format for the town hall is to have individuals submit their questions in writing. We do have pen and paper in the lobby. Obviously, you can see that people have provided us with questions. We do have a facilitator to help us with that. Brett Tillender is here, and Brett is capable of coming forward. He can give you an understanding of his role and how we move forward with answering those questions.
So I think a number of you said to me, what did you do? Draw the short straw tonight. So, but there is such experience and leadership in this room tonight. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brett Talander. I'm the CEO and president of Metro Detroit Youth Clubs. I also had the privilege of serving on the City Commission and a number of different commissions here in Royal Oak, member of the Optimist Club, and graduated from Royal Oak High School then, so many decades ago, known as Kimball, for those of you who remember. But my morning started this way. At 8 a.m. at the Salter Community Center, seniors showed up to walk, to participate in programs and activities all day long. There's a few seniors in this room right now. When I left to come here, the building was filled with the very future that matters in this room tonight. It was filled with kids. And I was joking earlier, there was a time in the past when it was only the boys' club. We apologize for all of you women who had to wait at the fence, but now it's Metro Detroit Youth Clubs. And the thing I would encourage all of us tonight, because a number of you said this to me as well, is that we don't talk enough and we don't listen enough. Tonight's about talking, about getting these questions out. Tomorrow, my understanding is there is part 2 of this that will allow for public comment. And tonight is about getting the facts out through the questions that you have created. The process for this will be that they'll come through the staff and then to me. Most of the questions are going to be likely directed to the consultants, then to the Plan Commission. And I've made a promise that any question that is relating to the plan tonight, you can't talk about the Lions tonight. Any question that is related to the plan is going to get asked tonight. So we're going to get going and we're going to get started with this. And I just want to be able to tell you this. Tomorrow I'm going to show up at the Salter Center. There's going to be seniors there and there are going to be kids there. Everybody who is watching and connected with this should be proud of Royal Oak because look, this room is full. Bill Harrison, your wife, and another commissioner created the Salter Center because tough decisions required good, open communication and solutions. So tonight, that's what this is about. So thank you for coming out. I'm inspired. The rest of the country should look like this. What do you think? So we're going to move on to our first question. Are you okay with that?
I'm okay with that. Thank you for that. I appreciate you being here, and let's get the show on the road here and get some questions on the table.
All right, thanks, Gary. So the first question is from Chuck Semchina. Please explain what is wrong with the goals and objectives of current master plan that requires all of them to be deleted and stricken. For example, goal number 1, to preserve and enhance existing neighborhoods as the foundation of a strong community. So I'm going to defer to Matt and Paul.
Sure. I think from the beginning, it's not that the goals and objectives are wrong in the current master plan. It's that the times have changed in demographics and how the city has grown since the prior master plan was completed, and that was really the purpose of getting into this. Now, I would say, in general, from the perspective of enhancing and preserving neighborhoods, I think from the beginning, and I'm sure we're going to get more into these questions as the evening progresses, that we found very quickly that the goal is to retain neighborhoods much as they are, and that is the goal that is carried forward in this draft of the master plan. We may have started with some discussions and questions early on that tested that theory and how much change is really desired, and we heard pretty strongly, though not unanimously, but pretty strongly, that a goal of retaining and enhancing existing neighborhoods is what's desired. There's some people that feel differently, but the majority that we've heard from feel that way, and that is carried forward. Now, in terms of other changes, there are needs and desires for the enhancement of different commercial corridors within the city that weren't really addressed previously. There's issues relative to transportation. There's other city goals that have emerged that have to deal with housing, getting around, aging in community. And so it's really about layering on or addressing those different issues. But I don't think that the goals of preserving and enhancing the existing neighborhoods were things that we have substantively changed, though I think as it is related to questions that had been asked at the beginning, early on, we asked a lot of questions about housing and where should housing go. And I know that there's a lot of history in recent years in terms of rezonings and development and where development has occurred and how that may or may not be perceived as infringing on existing neighborhoods. And so that's really one of the things that we endeavored to balance. And so, details and words in a master plan document, they're long, there's a lot of nuance there. But we try to set out as clearly as we can in the beginning that what we should be doing here, we feel, is determining where and to what extent growth should be allowed and making that easy, and where it shouldn't be allowed and making it hard in those areas.
Paul, anything?
Not much to add, just to say that, to reiterate the point that at the beginning of the process, that all of the goals of the master plan are considered, studied, and throughout there, as Matt said, there are different imperatives. The city has a sustainability and climate action plan, a new strategic plan. There's just other influences that when you do this, when you set out to update a master plan, those are the first steps to evaluate the context.
So I'm just going to ask, and Paul, I'm just picking on you, just make sure that you're close enough to the mic so everybody can hear you and so that the answers are clear. I'm going to turn to the chair and see if there's any comments from the Planning Commission to this particular question. There may be and there may not be, but I'm going to go that through you, Gary.
All right, that's, I think, the way to do it. Does any of the commissioners want to comment on the question that was posted? Okay, nobody.
Any from the staff? Good, okay. So not everybody has indicated, like Chuck did, that the first, and I don't know how you should play the lotto. You got the first question, Chuck. Not everybody wrote their name down. So if the name's down on here, I'm going to indicate who asked the question. So if you don't hear a name, it's because there's no name on it, but I'm still going to ask the question. So the next question is, what are your responses to the master plan survey from the residents to stop reducing lanes and stop adding bike lanes without public input? Matt?
Yeah, so that was definitely a lot of the content in the open-ended responses, public responses to things. So, it's a balance. There's input that we get from both sides of the subject matter from the public. So if we look at the open-ended responses, there's quite a lot of open-ended responses that were saying that they had trouble with lane reductions or they didn't agree with them. There were a few that did. When we look at the survey results, it was actually more 50-50. So in terms of people that supported and did not support, it was right down the middle. And then we also have experience in-person conversations with folks. We spoke to a lot of people who don't agree with lane reductions, and we spoke to a lot of people who wanted lane reductions. So this was one of these areas of significant balance, but probably more to the point is the reason that we had a traffic engineer on our team to bring in their professional expertise. So we asked them, the city had been in the process of doing a number of lane reductions, so they've been on this path for some time. There are some things that are, concerning in some areas, like losing the potential for on-street parking by neighborhood businesses, and that's an outcome of reductions that should be a consideration. And where bicycle facilities are or are not appropriate. So, some reductions may have provided for facilities that may not necessarily be the most appropriate for that location. But in terms of the goals for reductions and if they met the engineering, the technical engineering needs for traffic, we asked that of Jacobs, our traffic consultant, who gave us the general best practice, and they analyzed the number of roadways. From that analysis, they did identify that there are a number of roadways that had not been reduced yet that could be reduced in the number of lanes from 4 vehicle lanes to 3. That's a middle turn lane and 2 travel lanes, and the extra space used for either parking or bikes or extra space for trees or sidewalks or whatever it is. And a number of those clearly are at the mark that they qualify. Some are questionable, require further study. So we put that information into the report. But they also brought up a number of the reasons why those changes are being recommended. Now, it's recommended across the country, also here. A lot of it has to do with traffic safety, slowing down cars and making it easier to cross for pedestrians and cyclists. But additionally, I think there were a number of comments that repeated asking about emergency services and so forth. And there are requirements in the International Fire Code, for instance, that have specific widths that are not impeded by lane reductions. So in general, we asked, Jacobs, the traffic engineers, do these make sense and where, and sort of balance that with city goals. And a lot of what we heard, beyond traffic, and I think there is a concern for spillover traffic, and that's something that we brought up as it relates to diverters and crossing safety and other things like that in the neighborhoods, where you're able to actually make an impact or sort of discourage cut-through traffic, because that can be a concern today, even if there aren't lane reductions. But the amount of traffic on the roads technically qualifies them from AASHTO, the American Association of, Highway Transportation Officials. Anyways, there's a number of national organizations, engineering organizations, traffic engineering organizations. So we did ensure that everything fit into those standards. But in terms of the reason why we kept the recommendation in there, why we think it's good to continue to address the opportunity for lane reductions on major roads, has a lot to do with goals of getting around by foot, getting around by bike, and that has to do with crossing the roads. And your major roadways are impossible to cross. So it's really about slowing cars down and making the opportunity to cross at the mile roads and the major north-souths, but not to the extent that it creates excessive traffic. So you do have some places where it may not quite qualify, and we've identified some of those, but a lot of places do.
Anybody else?
Anybody in the commission? All right. People hear us talk all the time, but okay, go ahead.
Well, I just had a quick question for you to elaborate a little bit on the roads that quote-unquote qualify for the suggestion lane reduction. Is that based on actual traffic counts in terms of when you say qualify, it means that the level of vehicular traffic is not beyond a certain threshold, so it's okay then to consider a reduction? Is that what you mean by qualify?
Yeah, page 85 of the draft, there's a table on there under right sizing streets that notes the ADT, which is the average daily traffic, and the number of lanes, and then which are applicable for reduction and which ones should be studied. And the text that's before it, I believe, or no, actually right following on page 85 is a discussion about what size is considered to be the right opportunity to take for a reduction, which is right around 20,000 ADT and in the vicinity of that. So for instance, 12 mile is a little bit over the 20,000 ADT. So this says it should be studied. It's not a slam dunk for reduction. That's one that requires more analysis. But some other ones, let's see, 11 mile, that one is well below the threshold. It has been studied, and so the recommendation was to pursue that. 13 mile was well above the threshold, so that wasn't recommended to be pursued. But 14 mile was at a range that could be studied, but needs more careful consideration.
All right, other panelists? All right.
I just want to draw your attention just to a time issue. So I believe that it was published that this meeting would go until 8. The meeting will go till 9. So we've got great room in here, great questions that need to be heard. So for some of you, that may screw up what you were going to watch at 8:30, but at least there'll be people here behind that will ask the questions. So we'll be here throughout, so that doesn't mean at 8:10, if all the questions have been asked, that we all have to stay. Okay? So I would also encourage us to keep that in mind on the answers. I do appreciate the fact that the questions have been direct, the questions have been related to the plan, and the answers, whether we agree or not, have at least addressed the question. So that's helpful.
And
The next-
if I can just
Yes,
say,
good.
and also we're here, and sometimes maybe the question, the answer will generate another question, so people should feel free to write
more.
another question
Yes.
and submit it.
Please. So this question comes from Bill Harrison. Has the proposed narrowing of Woodward Avenue been computer model simulated for 61,000 cars per day? The property depth is not adequate to support multifamily housing and the requisite parking for residents and guests. A bike lane in the median crossing the turnarounds would be dangerous. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say this is probably the most complicated issue in the entirety of the plan. And since the feedback that we had seen, which was a lot of people skeptical of that proposal, so we sort of stepped back the terminology. So a lot of the imagery is in there. I think everybody agrees that a change is needed on Woodward. That may be because of the blighted businesses and the poor characteristics. Well, this is what we've also seen from in-person conversation, from open-ended comments. A lot of people had said that there's issues with parking. It's dangerous to pull in and out of the roadway. There's a lot of spillover traffic in the neighborhoods. There's a desire for more green space. There's blighted businesses. There are a lot of those opinions came through surveys, open-ended questions, the first one and the second one, also in-person discussions. Now, the other cities around in the region are pursuing lane reductions. So Ferndale's done it. Birmingham's on its way to doing that as well. And there's a regional group that existed, disbanded, is coming back together in order to study it through the corridor. So there was, I forget the year, but in the teens, there was a complete streets study for all of Woodward. That was the entire corridor. When we studied this in Birmingham, because we worked on their master plan before here, they had, that was a time when I-75 had just been shut down for all the repairs. So we were speaking to Michigan DOT at that time, and they had stated that the traffic volume on Woodward is elevated at present because of the I-75 construction, and that they're modeling, they've modeled the traffic on Woodward and the traffic on 75 such that when 75 opens back up in full, that the ADT on Woodward would drop below 60,000 vehicles per day. So we again asked Jacobs about this, the traffic engineers. We said, we know this is an issue and there's concern as to whether or not it's viable to reduce a lane or not. So they studied it. They said that they believe it's viable. This, of course, would have to be further studied just with anything else that has to do with the corridor. Michigan DOT has to agree. They own the corridor. But then we were looking at some of the other issues that people had. So Jacobs, our traffic engineers, said it looks like it's viable when 75 opens back up to reduce the lane of traffic and not have that reduce the sort of effectiveness of the roadway to carry the traffic that it needs. So then what we had drawn is one proposal. It could be anything, it's a sort of a further study issue, and that's how we changed the terminology from the prior draft to this one. But issues of cut-through traffic, that's something that's very difficult right now because all the roads end in Woodward, so it's really easy to turn off of Woodward into the neighborhoods. There's issues of parking spillover, and so that was one thing that really that's kind of where we were looking at housing as opposed to business, because housing ends up using less parking per square foot of building than business does. And so that was one way to potentially reduce the demand of parking. Of course, that also brings into play issues that residents have raised, which is having tall buildings near to the backyards. And that's an issue that has to be handled in terms of transitions of building heights. How far is the building from the adjacent residences, and control of that height. And that kind of gets into this, sorry if it's a kind of complicated, all these pieces, that kind of drives you into some of the zoning considerations. And I'm sure we're going to talk a lot more about zoning through the evening, but one consideration in this instance on 11 Mile, on Rochester, on any sort of major road, is going to be what is the transition between the directly adjacent residential properties and properties that may see higher development in the future. So that's something that is addressed by zoning and needs to be addressed by zoning, and it's not addressed today. So that's one aspect of change that's part of it. Now so that's one piece of the Woodward corridor, and then the other is a desire that we've heard from people who want to walk and bike to access businesses. We know that's super dangerous to do either thing right now in Woodward. So we were exploring, if you reduced a lane, what could that do? Now, in terms of the bike lane idea in the median, that came from the transportation engineers. We threw it out there. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work. I'm not sure. That's also something that would absolutely need to be studied. The discussion was from a regional basis. If you're biking to commute and you're commuting 10, 15 miles, you don't want to slow down for every single intersection. So you actually need a commuting route that is more direct. Would that one work or not? That I'm not sure. The transportation engineers thought it would, so we thought that was worth mentioning for a study. But in terms of the lanes on the side, if we're able to reduce one lane and not have that impact the traffic, then we studied that configuration from the building front to the existing parking and that interior lane, which is all part of the Department of Transportation's roadway, and found that you could rearrange that area to get more trees, more landscaping, to provide for parking, a travel lane, and also bike facilities. So we were trying to solve a lot of things with that and reduce the cut-through traffic by having one of those greenways disallowing the right-hand turn onto neighborhood streets. So that was our goal, to try to address all those things. It may not be perfect in everyone's mind, but we did certainly change the terminology in the plan to say, not to say do this, but to say consider this or other solutions that may address the issues that we've heard: cut through traffic, access to pedestrians and bikes, green space, and viable properties for businesses.
Any commissioner comments? All right.
So our next question comes from Susan Williams. Is the master plan a foregone conclusion? If not, then how does the administration plan to incorporate resident opinion, even if it's counter to any preconceived conclusions now incorporated?
Is that my question?
I think I can answer that question. So there isn't any preconceived thing. Let me just say this. We up here, you guys out there, you each have your own opinions, and your unique opinions should be expressed when we have the opportunity. Whoops, okay. But up here, we're not doing our jobs unless we take in all those comments and opinions from the consultants, from the public, from the staff, from other places we get it, like we go to seminars, and we have to take that all in when we're making our decision. So we do that. I can tell you everyone up here does that. So that's what I'll tell you.
The next question is, why does single family, specifically single family, need to be removed from the master plan wording if the plan is to protect single family housing?
Yeah, that was for me. So it is in there 29 times. I did a count because I've had the question asked plenty. Our goal is not to remove single-family zoning from the neighborhoods. We tried to clarify that as much as we could. So the one thing that maybe Paul, you can discuss the land use versus zoning, because they're two different things, and it can be a little bit confusing. Whereas best practice is not have duplication. Maybe you can talk about that for a second.
Sure. So in the sense that the master plan is an aspirational document, and it's a document that looks a generation into the future land use categories are intended to describe a character of what a place might be in the future based on the process, based on the analysis, and based on the engagement that's done during the process. So yes, it's sort of a leading, if everything is working properly, the zoning ordinance is updated in alignment with the master plan goals. But this is a high-level aspirational look at the future of each piece of land. After a master plan is passed, then there is a lot of work to do to decide the nuance of every zoning district. It is appropriate, and I guess a best practice is just how master plans are typically written, that 2 or 3 or 4 zoning districts might sit in one category of master plan future land use category, because the zoning ordinance of the law is very specific. The master plan needs to, because of its time horizon, be flexible and aspirational to guide the decisions about the land use law into a direction, but not write that law at this time.
Further, it's really page 30 and 31 of the document those are like the key pages. This is what's called the zoning plan. So that's what relates the future land use to zoning. So there are recommendations for zoning changes. As we've said many times, the main purpose for zoning changes in the document that are discussed are for the downtown, for corridors, for the neighborhood retail centers that exist today, for Woodward, and not so much for the single-family neighborhoods. However, we do see comments, some issues of neighboring properties flooding each other, loss of trees, houses that people feel are too big, those sorts of things. So we do identify all of that as things that could be addressed in zoning should you revise zoning in the residential areas. Now, we also say that's not the most critical place that zoning needs to be addressed. The critical places are these other areas. And so we split this zoning plan into two sections. Page 30 is areas of growth, and page 31 are areas of preservation. The areas of preservation, the neighborhood residential being the main one that you're concerned about right now. And that, I'll point out, you have one family residential and one family large lot residential. Those are what are permitted in this plan in the areas of neighborhood residential today. There's 2 restricteds. You see 2 family residential and multifamily residential. And if you follow down the R at the bottom is zoning district restricted to properties already zoned with this future land use. So we're not at all pushing for a change to those properties. Do we do that other places? Sure. That is not what we heard from the majority of resident input here. So the goal of this is to not change the zoning designation in neighborhoods. Now, we also, in terms of the description, tried to clear that up. But the reason that the future land use category doesn't say this land use category is just single family is because it's describing the broader area, and some neighborhoods mix large lot and small lot residential. Some have existing duplexes and multifamily, but it's, as clear as we could possibly make it that is not the goal, that is not what this is pushing for. And the goal here is to, here it says this place type is characterized by single family housing lots of various sizes and detached buildings set back from the sidewalk. Now, it does talk about the existing historic buildings that aren't like that, but it does not promote new buildings of that characteristic. There are some people in the community that we've spoken to that feel differently and that feel that there should be infill in neighborhoods, but that's not what we heard from the majority of people. So the position that we've taken is what we want to identify are the places that growth should happen, downtown corridors, and other areas of commercial and higher intensity uses that exist today, and to direct the growth there and not into neighborhoods.
I'm going to comment here.
Yeah, I just want to make the point, and Matt, if you can speak to it, to your ability, the fact that single-family zoning, as we understand it in this room, is somewhat unique to this country. And I think our current housing crisis kind of helps to explain that, in the sense that if you look at many other countries around the world, multi-generational housing within what we traditionally consider single-family structures is pretty common. What we know of as single-family zoning is really prohibitive for that. And right now, we do have families that are caught in this housing crisis. They don't have the ability to go find new housing on their own. And the notion of actually living with existing family and creating a multi-generational household is much more difficult to actually accomplish here. So I think when we talk about how we're labeling the different zoning districts, we really need to understand how the structures themselves are actually going to be used. And multi-generational housing within a single family area is something that we really need to consider, how we make that easier for families to be able to accomplish that.
Yeah, and that has to do with, the section, which I'm sure we'll hear about at a point, which is testing out accessory dwellings. It doesn't say enable them everywhere. It says pilot them, test them out. And that's sort of the hard thing with any sort of change in other places that have changed from single family zoning. Again, we're not suggesting that. We know the growth numbers and the needs, and think that a lot of the growth can be accomplished in the areas that we identified for growth. Now, single-family zoning in the U.S., that really comes with the advent of zoning and the post-war growth. The Royal Oak's oldest neighborhoods were developed before that, and you have a mixture of housing types historically that fit together. Back then is really the post-war growth that saw only one type of housing. Now, the sort of issue, what you see is it's really hard to express, but what you see in places that have allowed for more diverse types of housing in sort of any neighborhood is that the economic structure, what it costs to tear down a building and build a new building and sort of market that and so forth, is usually prohibitive anyways. So you don't see a lot of change necessarily, even if a change that zoning has occurred. So we really just said, okay, well, if that's the sentiment, then we won't suggest changing that here. There's a lot of targets in the corridors and the downtowns and these other commercial areas to accommodate housing, but you should try some accessory dwellings because they can have a really low impact overall. But again, just like I said, in terms of the economics of what does it take to redevelop a property at all, the economics of developing an accessory dwelling unit are not, it's not that easy. Still $150,000, $200,000 to build one. So that's still going to be prohibitive in a way that limits the sort of growth and application of that housing type.
Anyone else? Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
You're good. An effort just to make sure that we stay on topic. There's a question that came in that fit with this, and I'm just looking to see if there's a name here. George Gomez will get the joke. I grew up under Jack Salter, and you couldn't read his handwriting. It was called hieroglyphics. For those of you who are filling out these questions, help me out. I'm going to do my best to read this. So I don't have who it's from, but ADUs, I'm going to assume that I'm reading that right. This is an A, B, C, D question with a follow-up. So where/what areas of residential are being allowed neighborhoods? B, restrictions on lot size for buildings, and it has the word address highlighted. C, will legally binding parameters be set for size of unit, number of tenants prior to adoption of ADUs? And then D, hope you're writing all this down. Where are additional parking spots for ADU tenants, i.e. on-street parking? And I'm going to go to page 2, and I can repeat it if you need me to go back. I'll make sure that we stay on task with it too. Reduce or eliminate parking requirements citywide or are by area. What does this mean in relation to ADUs and on-street parking? And then lastly, water collection systems already are overburdened with houses now. Address ADUs and how it'll impact this. I hope I did my best for whoever wrote that.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't write down all of them, mainly because the first few are all related to the restrictions or the considerations that need to be determined before a pilot is enabled. So we did write in this, it wasn't allow this everywhere. It was say the text says this should be piloted, should be tested out, and here are a list of common elements that are either regulated or restricted for ADUs elsewhere in the country. And it may be unit size, occupancy type, all sorts of things, location on the property, minimum property size. All these sorts of things are to be included in a pilot project, what fits the community. And so that those would need to be part of a pilot project. Now this is not saying, we're not setting out the criteria for a pilot project. That would be determined later in the step of create that pilot project. And creating the pilot project would have to be would have to include what the rules are for accessory dwellings. So we lay out some of them. Okay, so that's a separate thing from the parking to a degree. But the parking side of things, that has a lot more to do with typically for housing and commercial. In most places, there is far more parking required than is needed. Now, that's not everywhere, and you can see spillover parking for some businesses. I'm sure people will say, look at the queuing line for Starbucks or, things like that. There are some businesses that create an excessive amount of parking and queuing and things like that. But for the most part, retail shops, restaurants in downtown and so forth, and downtown is a little bit different, but even neighborhood restaurants don't generally generate as much parking as is typically required for them. That in part is because the standards that tend to be adopted are kind of broadly applicable standards, and they're not related to the place. So the change that's being made in many places is to allow for the operator to figure out how much parking is needed for the tenants and to supply that parking, as opposed to the city knowing what the parking needs are going to be. Now, on the other side, on the ADU and street parking, you do have a great benefit of having street parking. I know that can be difficult for some people, but having parking on the street slows cars. It makes it safer for people that are walking and biking. So it's actually advantageous for neighborhoods. And I've lived now in my third apartment building with no parking whatsoever. Right now, 7 units, no parking. I've lived in 24 units with no parking. I've lived in 4 units with no parking. And it's never been more than a half a block away that I have to park, in a city that's much more dense than this. So it's more of a perceived problem typically than it is a real problem. And, one of the issues that you do have with having roads that don't have people parking along them is people speed. And there's a concern for pedestrian safety, for safety of kids in neighborhoods. So it does go towards assisting that. That's from the ADU. One additional unit in the backyard of, let's say, 2 houses on a block, which is probably the most that you'd ever get, doesn't have a huge parking impact on the neighborhood. But there are areas like Woodward is, of course, one of the very specific areas that needs special attention. But a lot of other places in the community, it's not really as much of an issue as it is a perception of an issue.
There was a question tied to this at the end with regards to water collection systems. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so that has to do with the combined combined stormwater and sewer system. So that's harder to address. It is in there in the water section in the first chapter that's dealing with stormwater systems and studying the opportunity for building a separated system. That's a big lift, but it's something that should be studied and has been done elsewhere in the state. But the only way that you can really get that handled is to make that change from a combined system to a separated system. And if it hasn't happened already, there's plenty of cities. I mean, I think where I live has been sued by the EPA for having a combined storm and waste system. It's a change that places have to make, but it's a big investment and it takes a lot of federal grants and dollars to get done.
Only that, just to clarify that issue, I mean, I don't think we have a problem with people flushing their toilet and the sewer's filled up. What we have a problem is when it rains, the system doesn't absorb a heavy rain. That's the issue.
Yeah, well, which is part of the combined system, but you do bring up a good point, which is the green stormwater management. So there is discussion in places where existing parks can be graded in ways to manage stormwater when you have heavy events. You're not out playing in the field in heavy rain, for instance, and to find other opportunities in streets and swales. And so there's a discussion on the hydrology of Royal Oak and the Red Run Basin and the sort of soils where you have this issue in the northwest portion of the city where the soils don't percolate, means the water doesn't get absorbed very easily, and so there's a greater need for providing some opportunities for stormwater storage there. We also mapped this out. It was great. I found a map somewhere. It looked like a napkin sketch, so we sort of redrew it. That was identifying the historic portions of the Red Run Basin that go through the city, and so some of them, we all know Vincetta had an exposed portion of this waterway historically that was covered over, but there are plenty of other places that it existed in the city, some of which are, there's some parks named after segments of this, I think like Moraes Park, that's part of the creek system that feeds in the Red Run. So it's really about identifying the sort of need for stormwater based on this historic hydrology that's been built over. So it's both the combined storm and sewer, but also the need to look at green infrastructure wherever you can get it. If that's in the streets, if that's in the parks, if there's some other ways to restore that, that's the way you need to sort of layer those both on to reduce the flooding.
Okay. Any other comments? All right, we're good.
Just a reminder, if there's a question to an answer to a question that's been asked and you'd like to go deeper with it, there is the opportunity to write another question and get it in. So don't hesitate to do that. I am going to give an award tonight to Janice Wagman. I can read this. Can you provide the names of other United States cities comparable in size, population, and climate to Royal Oak, and in a state with declining population that have implemented these proposals for higher density, including ADUs, right-sizing streets with bike lanes, eliminating surface parking in the downtown, etc., where the intended goals were achieved? If so, where?
Well, I think everybody's been doing this much more recently. So it's portions of the goals have been achieved, but not all of them. So I'd say the biggest one, and Paul, you might have some thoughts on this too, the biggest, so we have to think about Royal Oak in its context with Metro Detroit. So it's a city amongst this larger metro. So it's a bit more comparable to like Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the changes that they've made from an approach to biking and walking and infill in their downtowns. Let's set aside all the controversy over single-family homes there too. We're not talking about that, but we're talking about their focus on biking, transit, walking, and infill of historic neighborhood downtowns. Their historic downtown, and Minneapolis is more like the Detroit. St. Paul is like somewhere in between. But they've seen a lot of success in doing so. Buffalo's trying to, but they don't have, they've had a much more significant decline in population than Metro Detroit has. Do you have some examples, Paul?
I don't have specific city examples. I was just more going to comment on there's a statewide housing problem, and the government of the state of Michigan has a statewide housing plan to address aging housing stock. The fact that housing is becoming unattainable for many people, and I guess it's just in context, as Matt said, these problems are problems that communities across Metro Detroit are dealing with and grappling with in some way. So I don't have a case study, I guess, that ties a particular solution to everything that Janice just asked for.
But it's also not unlike the work that's been done in Cincinnati and in Columbus, both bigger than Royal Oak, but have neighborhoods that approximate the scale, and they've seen changes in their neighborhoods that they've been following similar patterns. Now, the growth thing is interesting, and that's where it's a little bit confusing. Like, well, how did we lose population and we need more housing units? Because I know that's been asked, and that has to do with the reduction in family size. And typical household size has been going down as the population had declined. So you've ended up needing more housing units for the same number of people, and so that fuels the demand for housing. But then there's also a regional demand for housing. It's not only the folks who already lived here needing housing. There's the sort of attractiveness. I mean, you all love Royal Oak for reasons, and there's a desire to live here for many people in the region, so that does drive growth in the city. It's not like boom times everywhere, but it is an incremental growth that right now, because it's hard to build, and you don't have a bunch of greenfield land, so what you have is infill. Because it's really hard to build, that then becomes more expensive. But in terms of bike infrastructure, there are certainly cities that are investing a lot in that in cold climates. That's why I bring up the Minneapolis area. Again, bigger city, but they've invested quite a lot into bikes in transit, but also crazy hot places. Like Phoenix has invested a lot into bikes in transit, and you wouldn't want to bike there in the summer, just as you wouldn't want to bike here in snowy conditions. I'd say we're also seeing that in some Canadian cities. So Toronto and Montreal have been adding quite a bit of bike infrastructure. Winnipeg has been doing the same. So it's not really so much a winter thing. As for lane reductions, that is also happening pretty much in most cities across the country, whether it's a hot climate or cold climate, because there is a sort of renewed push for people to want to be able to walk. And so you're kind of seeing that everywhere. In terms of a specific case study, I don't have off the top of my head. Here's the equivalent to Royal Oak somewhere else. Size-wise, right now I'm working in same size as Bentonville in Arkansas, of all places, but vastly different condition. They're growing rapidly, but they've realized that in order to deal with their traffic issues, that they need to both have housing near where people are going out and to jobs and shopping and so forth, and also build the bike infrastructure to connect it all. Their issue, just like most other places, is there's not really a lot of transit, and there's not a great public support for transit, but they're trying to set themselves up so that they can support it when it does come.
I would just make the comment, when you're trying to compare places, no place compares to Royal Oak. Sorry, people. I'm not going to accept that. But I would just say really quick about Minneapolis. I've been there, and those crazy people use their rail trails in the middle of the winter and it's snowing out, and they're commuting to work on their bikes. I've seen it. Anybody else? Yes.
Yeah, Gary.
I would say the subject illustrates an answer to an earlier question, which is why the master plan that was approved now more than 20 years ago needs an update. And And it's because we see, I mean, 20, 25 years ago, the passion for cycling and walkability was not really driving people's desires here in Royal Oak. And yet today we see, especially among young people, to Mr. Talander's point, the future of our city, young people who value walkability, who want to cycle. And so the master plan includes features driven by the data that the consultants have collected that says that we should be providing those options, those non-motorized options for the future of our city.
Which you know, I know there's a lot of people that have commented on open-ended comments that they don't see cyclists on bike lanes. We've also had a lot of cyclists saying we don't have bike lanes and we don't feel safe. But we've also looked at the data on Strava, which a lot of cyclists use, not all cyclists, but a lot of cyclists use. And Royal Oak has a significant, if you look at all of Metro Detroit, there's a huge number of cyclists in Royal Oak as compared to anywhere else. And we've heard, you know, personal stories. I've seen people out there. I saw somebody today on Main Street north of 11 Mile. I was thinking they're crazy, but you know, the people are there, but we also respect the right type of facility in the right place, and that's why we want to provide for, you know, safer ways for families that are not sort of the traditional bike lane. But we've also heard from folks that say, well, we also want to ride faster to be able to get longer distances, and we need a variety of facilities.
All right. Mr. Ellison.
Thank you, Gary. In our discussion about how does Royal Oak compare with other communities, it occurred to me, isn't it tougher to try to do that when we've got a city like Royal Oak of, you know, 12 square miles and 78,000 people, and we're right next door to another community that's very similar, who is right next door to another community that's very similar to that? How much impact do our neighboring communities have on our ability to accomplish what we're trying to do within our master plan? I know we talked about the impact of water, sewer, and we're all in the same system. I mean, all of our stuff goes down the same drain as everybody else's. So whatever we can do in our community to make our life easier or better or whatever, we still got to deal with, you know, Birmingham and Bloomfield, because they all drain down the same pipe. And so how easy is it for us to accomplish our goals without having to bring in the other communities to do the same thing?
Yeah, well, you definitely need regional coordination. One thing that's convenient with Birmingham is they drain mostly to the Rouge River and not to the Red Run. And you know, Royal Oak's at the headwaters of the Red Run, so you have less of a neighboring community runoff issue than a soils issue here. But traffic certainly is a major regional problem, and that's not going to be addressed until there's more change in surrounding communities. Now that is something that Birmingham's trying to change. That's something that we're looking at here. That's something that Ferndale's addressing, and also something that Detroit's addressing. Now some other communities. Well, I know Sterling Heights is looking at that too with the redevelopment of their mall, and some of the other surrounding communities. We've seen their plans addressing it, but some others don't. So it's like a little bit of a mixed bag. Though if you look at the programs from the county and from SEMCOG, the Southeast Michigan Council of Governments, that they're all advocating for relatively similar changes from a regional basis. But yeah, you are impacted from others. But I'd say in terms of the region, your directly surrounding neighbors are probably the most on board in the same direction that we're looking at going here. And I'll ask Paul, you're much more familiar with what's happening in that realm.
I think you answered it pretty well, though, actually. I think that, you know, the plan identifies the problem or the challenges that require regional solutions, and the language, as Matt mentioned earlier, gets more into study and look into cooperation and advocate in this direction versus things that the city can't control itself.
So is it fair to say that in the end, if we don't get cooperation from our neighbors, we don't have the plan we may want, and we have to modify our plan to adjust the realities of what our neighbors are doing?
To some extent, I'm not sure what's going on to further to the west. I think that you end up getting much less walkable and more auto dominant in that direction. I'm not sure, Paul, if you know what those cities are doing. I know certainly to the north and the south, and also to the east, that there's a similar direction happening there, and a focus on their business centers, their downtowns, if they have them, and in providing for a greater degree of walking and biking. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and that's definitely happening along the Woodward corridor. It's sort of a mixed bag as you move further out, but as I said earlier, there's a lot of these problems that the entirety of the Metro Detroit region are grappling with, and they have different solutions to it. But along the Woodward corridor, I think there's a lot of communities that are sort of embracing these challenges in similar ways.
All right, anyone else? Back
So
to you.
just to draw everybody's attention, we're moving into our second hour together, and at times I get hangry. So if you got to get something, get it. Bathrooms are right outside. Help yourself if you need to. This question is important. It's a two-part. How is the master plan expected to impact housing affordability, and how will it impact those attempting to age in place? Royal Oak is our home.
Yeah, that's a difficult one because we don't have the ability to require affordability, so the state doesn't allow it. There's two ways that Royal Oak can deal. Well, three ways that Royal Oak can deal with affordability. One has to do with properties that are owned by the city, because you do have greater control of those, though they're limited. So you only have so many properties. A lot of them are the downtown parking lots. You're not getting rid of parks. So there's only so many places that you have that you can control, but in those you have the opportunity to offer a developer RFP to say, we have this property and we have this goal, and we will donate the land if you will provide housing at this certain format, whether that's housing for seniors or if it's a certain income level. So that's one tool. The second tool is just supply, just making it easier to develop in the places that it's okay to develop. So that's kind of the identifying the areas for growth. If we can make it easier to build in downtown and the corridors and the areas that are not in the core of neighborhoods, then that at least reduces the time and cost burden on development. Does that deliver affordability? Not necessarily. But it has the potential of delivering more units to the market. And so, if you're more a market driven person, then you say, well, that's going to balance our supply and demand to some degree. The third is to provide for a system of bonuses. That's one direction that the city has taken from a policy standpoint. It's not built into your code right now, so it's a little bit murky in terms of how you might achieve that. And that's a hard one because in a way you can see that giving a bonus, which basically is to say we're going to cap the height of development in most places, but if you deliver a certain number of affordable units, and define what that means, then we'll let you build higher. So that's one way you can do it, is artificially constraining development to then provide that bonus. But then it becomes a little bit unpredictable, because now you're saying, well, why did this building come in at 4 stories and this one came in at 8 stories? And it's because it's kind of like a patchwork in terms of how that's solved. So what we've recommended in here is more the market-driven solution. Just make it easier to develop in the places that it's okay to develop, with the goal that you'll get a greater diversity of housing in the market, but to use your control of some public lands to require some degree of addressing affordability. But that's limited. And so whether you go down the bonus route is a little bit more of a difficult situation, because that kind of gets to the lack of predictability, which kind of underlines a lot of people's fear and angst of what they've seen in recent years in development. Is, I don't know where the next big project's going to come, and it might be next door to me. And so reducing that for greater predictability means that you sort of lose one potential tool. So we've really pushed towards trying to clear up the market-based solutions as much as possible, and sort of stay away from the bonus side. But that is an option and an opportunity.
Can you, just one second, can you speak to the second part of that question, which was how will it impact those of us who are attempting to age in place?
Yeah, so aging in place, for the most part, there are two ways to address that. One is by providing housing that is accessible and affordable, but within proximity, relative proximity to neighborhoods. You probably don't want to move across town, but we're not building multifamily housing within the core of a neighborhood. But if you do have it nearby in sort of an existing retail center or on a corridor, that provides for some opportunity. It's not necessarily age-restricted housing. That's a harder thing. We're not forcing that from a city's perspective. That's a sort of market solution. Though you do have the opportunity, again, with city property to make that restriction on the development of that city property. Most of that's downtown. That could be a good thing in terms of proximity. We understand the existing senior housing in downtown has a huge wait list. So that, providing more housing that is going to be accessible, and anytime that you are building over a certain number of units in a building, you're required to meet accessibility standards. So that's sort of a core baseline. Then the other is whether or not the accessory dwelling unit is used for that purpose. Some people have commented, well, second floor units, nothing that says an accessory dwelling needs to be on the second floor of a garage. That's traditionally a place that it's been built, but you can have a freestanding house to the side. You can also have an accessory unit that is within the house, like a ground floor suite, for instance. So there's ways to achieve that within the current neighborhood context. But again, most of it is in having housing developed in places that are proximate to neighborhoods, not in the middle of them, which is also proximate to parks and other city services, or the use of public properties to sort of require that type of development. Again, you have that opportunity, but it's relatively limited in terms of the supply of public property.
Yes, I was just going to make sure you answered that too. And I have a question now for Tim or Joe, just to clarify for the record. We already have zoning that allows accessory dwelling units that are attached in the neighborhoods. Is that correct?
We have an zoning ordinance provision that allows for senior accessory housing, and that is a process by which someone obtains a special land use permit in front of the Planning Commission. It's extraordinarily seldom used at this point in time.
Okay, but it's specific, goes to the question, though, it's specifically designed for seniors.
Correct.
Okay, thanks. Any comments? Other comments? Proceed.
Next question. Developers seem to get their way throughout the city and the new master plan. Do you believe that the new master plan should be in favor of the residents' pleas for balance of density, or just let the developers take over? I'll defer to the chair.
Well, I'll only say this, that the people who come before the Planning Commission are generally developers because they're developing the properties. So that's who brings us projects. So I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, yeah, but I'd say 99.9% of people 99.999% of the people that we talk to are residents and not developers. I think in the process of most of the engagement, we had one developer during one of our meetings at the Charrette who works on affordable housing and brought up the desire for having a form-based code so that they had predictability in terms of what they could develop, so they could do so more readily. But otherwise, the development community, we did talk to some affordable housing developers early on just to understand what their roadblocks were, and their roadblocks are really just this issue of everything going through a planned unit development process in order to build, and that's equally a problem for the residents and the developers. From the residents, it's because you just don't know where something's going to happen, because essentially anything could happen anywhere. And like, that's a huge problem. That's also a problem for the development community. So that's a place where you have shared goals, but their desires, they weren't here front and center at the table with their desires. It was more so talking to the residents, and we heard a little bit from the development community, but not all that much.
So we've heard from the planning team, the consulting team, that people want to live in Royal Oak. It's a desirable community. And we also know that our residents want goods and services. And there are businesses, developers that want to come here and provide those goods and services to us, and to allow the people who want to live here to come and live here. And the job of the Planning Commission is to listen to those proposals and negotiate to make sure they meet the needs of our community and accommodate the people who are already here. And Matt has said this, but I'll say it again. One of my goals, and I think my fellow commissioners, is to establish guidelines for that development to eliminate the free-for-all of planned unit developments, to come up with standards that residents expect and that developers say, okay, as long as that's all right, then I can go forward and I can reduce my costs by following the existing guidelines. And those conditions will have yet to be negotiated, but that's what zoning will do, is establish sort of the physical conditions that people can build in, again, to meet the expectations of residents, and also to be able to provide the space and goods and services that people desire.
Right. Mr. Cantina?
So to follow up on Chair Casada's point, the developers are bringing projects before us, but they're only bringing projects before us that the market supports, which is kind of what Commissioner Douglas was stating. We're not necessarily beholden to the developers, but the reality is they're not going to bring a project forward that in some form or fashion isn't desired by the city, or the market forces telling them that that's the project that should be brought forward. How does that benefit the city? It helps keep the city relevant. If we were not continuing to develop with the times, there's demographic shifts, there's cultural shifts, social shifts. The developers will only bring projects that make sense economically. They're not necessarily going to bring projects forward that they're not going to be able to build out. And the market is telling them what they're going to be able to build out. So the developer certainly had, input into this process, but no different than any other person that had input into the process. And they're the ones that actually affect some of the change that some of these rules put in place.
Mr. Ellison?
I think what gets lost sometimes is the tremendous amount of development that is happening in our city. The large portion of it being those that don't have to come in front of the Planning Commission. We've got residential builders out there that are building homes or building businesses that meet all the requirements of our zoning ordinance, and all they got to do is get a building permit, and they build it and they open it. They don't get the publicity that the big developer that's got to come in front of the Planning Commission gets. They don't get to have people come in and speak in front of them for or against their project. They just go out and build their project. But the impression I get, some people are so down on developers, or are they down on developers, or are they down on the projects? I mean, that's why Planning Commission is here, so we can look at the project and determine whether it's the best use of the land, best use of the area. But while we're busy doing that with 2 or 3 plans a month, maybe, we've got hundreds of houses and businesses being built out there that you just show up. And, I look at some projects down on Lincoln near my home, strip of buildings that was empty. They didn't come in front of the Planning Commission. They applied, they built, and they're open. And that happens all over this city. If you look at a new business, chances of it coming in front of the Planning Commission are very slim if they followed all the zoning ordinances. So, they're making a developer sound like a bad guy. The developer comes in front of us if he's got a big project that he thinks can help us and help him. We're going to see it, and it's going to get publicity, and you're going to see it on TV, and we're going to talk about it. But the guy that just wants to build a new house or open a new store, he's just going to go in the planning department, get a permit, and build a damn thing. So not all development is bad.
All right, any other comments? Okay, back to you.
Next question, and I'll direct this to the chair. With all of these votes and meetings, how are you still moving forward? The citizens have spoken, and you're not even using Michigan companies.
All right. I can only say that I don't, not using Michigan companies is probably referring to the consultant, but we did interview 4 consultants. I thought they were all good. And we have, I think, picked a good one. Of the 4 good ones, we picked a good one. So that's how we're moving forward, according to the statute, according to our duties.
And a significant portion of the process is based, significant portion of that process was conducted by McKenna. And where's McKenna based?
Northville,
Thank
Michigan.
you.
All right. Any other responses? Go ahead.
So next question, and thank you for whoever submitted this. I can read every word. On the future land use map, page 23, it doesn't show neighborhood edge on the west side of Maine, just north of 13 Mile. Is there a reason for the difference between the east and the west side of Maine? I think this area, where I live, is a great place to welcome more neighbors, close to parks, schools, downtown Clawson, bike lanes, bus routes. Please consider changing both sides of Maine, north of 13 Mile, to neighborhood edge.
Yeah, I'd say the reason up there that we didn't have that portion of Maine is because the units, so the housing that's there right now, the lots face onto the side roads as opposed to Main Street. So that's why we didn't map it there. You know, progressively, I'd be happy to map plenty of more edge, but you know, in terms of the decision making on what got edge and what didn't get edge, it had to do with which way the lots were oriented. So on the east side of Maine, those lots front onto Maine, and so those were edge. On the west side of Maine, those lots front onto the side streets, and so they're just, you know, maybe 50 feet wide on the side street. So we didn't map it there because of the way that they're oriented.
All right.
Good.
Good.
Next question. About the new master plan. It seems everything is for profit. Can we do anything just to have less density, or is the master plan just a takeover of every little space so no space is left for quiet or beauty?
All right. I'm gonna pass that on to our planners because I don't know how to answer that one either.
Well, I mean, you know, really for the most part, when we're talking land use is about accommodating growth and change. And, you know, I'd say it's probably a big thing to underscore is, you know, the love that folks have for the neighborhoods and the parks and the community. And that is a big part of the preservation. It doesn't become as much of a focus necessarily when your focus is on how do you accommodate and deal with growth and deal with goals for allowing biking and walking and other things within the community. You know, there is also a core portion of this related to parks. It's always funny because you all did the parks plan, and then I'm like, well, you should also do this in the next parks plan, which is to say to look at the accommodation of different facilities and parks throughout the community. So again, in terms of allocating, you know, in terms of dealing with growth, you know, the goal is to allocate that in places where it makes sense under, you know, sort of these commercial corridors and so forth, but not everywhere else. So, you know, I would say that perhaps a lot of the discussion is about where growth occurs because that's what future land use tends to be. But it's not here saying densify the heck out of the city and have no more trees. In fact, there's quite a bit of discussion about tree preservation and the addition of trees where they don't exist on neighborhood streets and in diversifying the tree canopy so that it's resilient for the future.
And I'm just going to follow up. To me, everything's a trade-off. Okay, first of all, I should probably not go into this, but zoning is actually, the whole thing probably deserves a session of talking about the origins of zoning and because it's very restrictive, okay, to tell somebody how they can use their property. But I think that our master plan is heading in a good direction. I think it's preserving things that need to be preserved, but the action is in these corridor areas. That's where the developers come to us. They come to the Planning Commission, and that's the area we're fighting about. That's what we have to address. I think there's lots of beautiful, quiet places. And by the way, I would say one of the ways you can quiet things down is to do road diets, because roads are loud. So everything's a trade-off. So we have to consider those things up here on our side of the table. We consider all those different competing interests.
So Matt?
Commissioner,
Oh, I'm sorry.
Commissioner Douglas.
Yeah, if you look at the map, the areas that are targeted for growth are areas that are already developed. 11 miles is a good example. You have, commercial buildings, restaurants, retail businesses, commercial businesses. So, to say that a substantial amount of land is being taken over and converted from, some quiet bucolic use into some busy commercial use is really not the case. The growth is targeted where there has been growth in the past. Sometimes those areas may be somewhat blighted or underutilized, but the plan is not eating into our quiet bucolic areas or our 53, however many parks.
Mr. Ellison.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I'm kind of stunned here. If you look back at the city for the past 10, 15 years and the amount of investment we've made in our parkland, we've just opened a 40-acre park that was exclusively for golfers, and now it's for everybody. And that's a tremendous amount of land that the city has dedicated for recreational use and for families. We've just modernized a very small park at Beechwood and Crooks Road, the Hammer Park, that we took a pretty basic unused piece of land and turned it into something that we can all be proud of. And then you go around all the different parks in the community. I know the park across the street from me. We've just got a tremendous amount of investment in recreational activities. And so we're taking our parklands and we're investing it, and then we're also trying to, separately from that, make our investment in the community as far as businesses and residential. And the bottom line is, as much as we don't want to talk about it, property tax is the lifeblood of any community. We can't live on parks alone. We've got to be able to invest the land that we have into the best return for the community so that we can invest that money, that taxpayer money, back into the community and make it better. And that's what this city has done, in the past 20 years that I've been involved in it. And, I think we've done pretty good. But to make a statement that we're dedicating everything to developer and nothing to the residents, I think is a very unfair statement.
All right, anybody else? Mr. Contino.
So the question asked referenced profit as it relates to this master plan. And I think the master plan itself is blind to any sort of profit motive. What this document does is it's essentially setting out the framework for land use policy that is needed to sort of meet or is intended to meet the needs of the community. And that spans a wide variety of challenges: increasing housing, increasing open space, better biking and walking. Those are all, a myriad of challenges that this land use policy is intended to help solve. None of that has anything to do with profit. So I just wanted to address that because I think there's a lot of misconceptions around why we may have some of the designations, why we may have certain growth areas. None of it has anything to do with profit, and has everything to do with trying to meet the needs of the community, which can be varied.
Anyone else? Back to you.
Have you read the responses to our own spring 2023 and November-December master plan survey that are pasted on the planroyaloak.com website? Have you read the public's request to not narrow any more roads in that same survey?
Yeah, we addressed this question previously, and that was that there are quite a few people that have an opinion that narrowing roads is not the right thing to do. In terms of open-ended comments, there's a much smaller number who have said we need the roads narrowed for pedestrian and bicycle safety. But then there is also the number of respondents who did not enter into the comments anything open-ended, and there was a 50-50 split in that same survey in terms of people that were in support and not in support, and thus we, as discussed before, elevated principally the professional judgment of both our traffic engineers and our own experience that it's safer to do so and important for the city to continue to do so where it makes sense. So yes, there was a lot of comment on there, but it was 50-50 in terms of the actual opinion, whether or not there was support or lack of support.
All right, anybody want to follow up, other than to say that I think, yes?
I'm hesitant to jump in here with this one, but I'll ask it anyways, maybe you get the answer. I've been told many times, and I have yet to hear a clear answer on this, that many of the roads that we redo that are supported by federal highway money, there's restrictions that come with that money, that certain criteria needs to be met, and some of that is pedestrian safety issues or traffic calming, that kind of stuff. So some of the roads we've got in this community where it's determined that it can't absorb a road diet, it can't absorb a bike lane, and if we do that, we can get federal dollars. Is that a fairly true statement?
Yeah, but Joseph might be the best to address the details more.
I was half listening and half reading the questions to figure out the next series. I'm not an expert on that.
The question was simple. How much part of the decision of which roads to put a road diet on or put a bike lane on is dependent on the ability to get federal funding to help offset the cost of that road?
I don't know what the percentage is, but that's certainly a factor. Yes, certain roadways to receive funding need to be able to move certain volume of traffic at a certain timing intervals. So that is critical. Yes.
But I'd say that it's also tied to the Federal Highway Administration's standards, which is what are referenced in terms of the volumes for lane reductions, and you're finding more and more at the federal level and at the state level requirements to provide accommodations for cyclists and pedestrians, which didn't used to be parts of the standards when the roads were widened in the first place.
So it's safe to say that these decisions of putting a bike lane in or road diet, it's not contingent on the whims of the city commission.
I mean, not entirely. You could not take the money.
Yeah, I mean, if we want to not do the road and not take the improvements, then yes. So that there's other factors that go into this rather than just personal desire to appease the bike riders.
Yep.
And I would just say, I think that, speaking for myself, and I think probably for all the commissioners up here, we read everything that comes our way. We read all the surveys. I can tell you for sure that I read all the comments, and I continue to read comments whenever I get them. I don't put anything aside. I read every single thing.
Just draw your attention to your watch and your phone or whatever you're keeping time on. We're at the halfway point, so we said we would go till 9 o'clock. I see plenty of questions on the counter, but I invite all of you to continue to write those questions so that we can get through to them, all of them by 9. Next question is, why aren't we using the single-family overlay districts to address existing duplexes and small multifamily and single-family areas?
Those operate at the zoning level, so that's something that doesn't come into play at future land use. So the master plan dealing with future land use doesn't deal with overlays. That's entirely in the realm of zoning and would be for consideration with any changes that might be made to zoning following this. And again, as I mentioned, zoning changes are most important in the areas identified for growth and change, less so in other areas, but there are certain desires for change in those areas from a zoning perspective that may not be growth, but related to the preservation of sort of existing character.
All right, back to you.
This is another question from Chuck Semchina. How is striking all of the provisions in the current plan designed to protect our single-family neighborhoods going to preserve and enhance them?
I guess I'll start. It's a new master plan. I mean, we could adopt it, but we hired some guys to write another one. So that's part of the process.
Yeah, and as part of that, we read and evaluated the current master plan and what has been achieved and what is in alignment with goals and what is not in alignment with goals. And again, like we've discussed from a single family protection standpoint, we have from a position and in the text stated very clearly that the goals of this master plan are not to increase housing in those neighborhoods and to protect the character of those neighborhoods. And then in addition to support by increasing tree canopy as well. There's considerations for issues that we've heard, as I've mentioned already, that people would like to be solved in their neighborhoods. Some issues with the scale and character of new housing, with preservation of trees, with flooding and so forth, that could be addressed in zoning rewrite. But again, it's not the target of the goals of this master plan. So in doing so, we've not, the focus has, so preservation of existing neighborhoods is in there. The main focus of the master plan, though, is in the areas of growth and change. So it's the prior one may be principally preservation focused. This one is principally focused on the future of the areas of the city that are currently growing and targeted for growth in a way that could be supportive of the city overall and the surrounding neighborhoods, but not in changing the neighborhood. So I don't think that we're really that far off from those goals.
Yeah, and I just want to follow up. I mean, I took the question, why do we need a new master plan? Well, the statute says we have to review it, but think about this. When it originally was made in 2002, I don't even know if they had iPhones then. Certainly we didn't have Amazon. We didn't have Amazon trucks in every street. We didn't have people working from home. The world was different 20 years ago, and it would be, I think, irresponsible for us to not review the master plan. Just because you make a new master plan doesn't mean you change every goal in it, but it would be irresponsible not to look at the new world that we live in, and that's what we're doing.
This is not an honest town hall meeting.
I agree. All right, any other comments?
So the next question is from Kate Pultz. Does the master plan through zoning or otherwise address short-term properties, Airbnbs, VRBOs, in neighborhoods where homeowners are affected by constant turnover, among other issues? Will the ADU zoning prevent them from becoming short-term rentals?
Well, from an ADU perspective, that's something that needs to be considered in terms of what the rules are for ADUs. But from a master plan perspective, that's not in the purview of a land use plan. So that's something that's city policy that could be considered. A lot of cities are dealing with that right now. In terms of ownership as well, that's not really something that is addressed at this scale either. Zoning actually can't address ownership either. So people have some questions and concerns about, whether something is owner occupied or renter occupied, and you actually can't legally address that in zoning either. But in terms of short-term rentals, that's something that would need to be addressed from an ordinance standpoint, not really a master plan issue.
Commissioner Douglas.
People may not realize this. The city within the past couple of months has updated its rental property ordinance. Certainly short-term rentals always needed to be registered with the city just as any long-term rentals were. But we have added provisions that allow us to inspect not only the exterior but also the interior of all rental properties, including short-term rentals. We are requiring property owners to identify themselves, but most importantly to identify an agent who is geographically nearby and is with their contact information, so that there are issues with any of those short-term rentals. We have the city, the police department, the building department have a contact person that they can call who is responsible for the care of those properties. So we've just implemented this. We will see how it pans out, but the City Commission has addressed that issue.
All right, back to you.
Why do you have to worry about cut-through traffic in neighborhoods if you have enough lanes for main road traffic?
Well, you have cut-through traffic regardless. It's not necessarily incumbent upon road diets whether or not you have cut-through traffic. That has much more to do with the fact that the regional traffic flows through Royal Oak, and therefore why in the proposal for greenways we look at diverters and other means of managing cut-through traffic. You have it today, you're going to have it, it's just in perpetuity. That is how traffic flows. People get a convenient alternative route to take, or maybe there's a delay at a turn signal. The delay of the turn signal may not be due to the lane reduction. It could be any number of things, and people find cut-through routes. So it's not correct that the lane reduction drives cut-through traffic, but cut-through traffic exists because the regional roadway network is really over-encumbered by regional traffic and not really so much local traffic. So it's really people cutting through from a regional standpoint if they're on Coolidge, and Coolidge is backed up, especially with that 14-mile jog, for instance. So, it's really an existing problem, not necessarily exacerbated by road diets, but one that can be dealt with, and there's ways to deal with. We identified some of them. Happy to look at more opportunities to do so other than those identified. But you have it today, and it's going to continue whether you reduce lanes or you don't reduce lanes because of the regional situation.
Before we add for more questions, I'm just going to add this question to it because they're in the same folder. How can you say that a road diet is safer? Roads are more narrow, traffic is increased.
Yeah, well, that's it was a 20 to 40% reduction in incidents. I think that was a federal study on road diets. So, I'm not the one authoring the studies that says they're safer. There's many agencies, traffic engineering organizations that we used to argue with all the time. And now they've studied it. They've built road diets. They've studied them, and they found that reduction. I think it was 20 to 40%. I think it's again on that page 85 of the report.
Mr. Espy.
Thank you, Mr. Casada. If I could go back to the first portion of that question, I think the one key element that we're missing here, and I'm going to put on my traffic committee hat temporarily, we had an example in front of us at the traffic committee just a couple months ago where people had discovered, and again, it's largely because of Waze, it's because of Google Maps, that if they were driving down Crooks over by the Planet Fitness, made a right on Northwood, they could take it straight through to the Shrine and catch Woodward over there. And I'm going to get the numbers slightly wrong, but Northwood had something like a 700% increase in the traffic that they had on their street. And again, this is all as a result of wayfinding. So the fact that people are cutting through, I really don't buy the fact that there's a component tied to road diets, but there's absolutely a component tied to the fact that people use their wayfinding. It says turn right on Northwood, so you turn right on Northwood. So we ended up having to install speed bumps and hopefully create some traffic flowing over there. But there are examples of that throughout our city and every city, and we've all seen it where for whatever reason there's cut through traffic on Street X that 10 years ago before wayfinding that didn't happen, and that's just one of the realities that we have to deal with. And so there's always going to be adjustments made as we're dealing with the changing times and new technologies. Thank you.
All right, other comments? Back to you.
Next question is, why not provide single-family designation for the section of Royal Oak for 12-mile road and north thereof? Our city has become a downtown and suburb all in one.
All right.
Well, presently it's not all single family.
Yeah.
Up 12 mile and north. The main change in the master plan is around the Delmare industrial area that is changing in format already today, and areas around that. The goal essentially being to create an opportunity for a small main street there that is of basically capturing traffic rather than dispersing traffic from there to elsewhere in the city. But anything that is currently on there that is not single family is something that today is already not single family.
Any comments?
No,
there?
it's 12.
Okay, back to you.
How can you say that you want to preserve single-family areas when you want to allow ADUs, backyard homes. That changes single family to multifamily, doubles the density, severe reduction of green space. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it hasn't been proven out that that is what happens when you enable accessory dwelling. I know accessory dwellings are not a whole nother house. They're not double the density, but they do allow for some small increase in housing. But as I mentioned, I think earlier, what is it, $150,000 to $200,000 to build an accessory dwelling unit. So anywhere that's enabled them, you know, it's sort of like the math that is hard to recognize. You don't get adoption or absorption in that many areas. So, you know, where I live, they even reduced the impact fees. They made it free for city processes, free for taps and so forth. And you still maybe get one ADU every 6 blocks, maybe 10 blocks at most. So you're not going to see an absorption like that. So in that opinion, it doesn't change the character, but provides for a small amount of additional housing.
All right. Any other, you want, Mr. Ellison?
Yeah, just a quick comment. My daytime job is working with the older population in our county, and there is a tremendous need. One of the biggest problems and questions I deal with on a daily basis is, where can I put my parents if they can't live on their own? And that's where an ADU comes in. You can give them a small residence behind your home, one family, 2 different dwellings, so that you're in a position, you're in a position to take care of your elderly parents or whatever it is that you need to do, and you have them home. And there's multiple ways to do it. It's like the drawing up there. You can build a separate residence. You can build into your own home. You can add on to their home. But it allows them to build a unit where your parents, as they age, can be self-sufficient, but still have you on the other side of the door. And it's becoming very, very popular. We just haven't got enough of it in the county right now. And, you know, we're looking at different ways to do it. You know, there's other communities out there that allow ADUs, and they're very, very successful for taking care of your elderly family. So they're not all bad. I mean, if you're going to go in there and put a bunch of ADUs and turn them into apartments, yes, that's a problem. But if you're looking for a way to help your elderly parents or elderly family members survive through the last golden years of their life, it's better than having in the backyard. I mean, they're right there. So I think ADUs need to be looked at in a more positive light rather than a negative light.
All right. Commissioner Douglas.
Yeah, to be clear, if we were to approve this document as it stands today, that does not mean that we will automatically have accessory dwelling units all over the city. The plan calls for an exploration of that subject with further community input, with the possibility of a test case in perhaps a block or 2. So that this is not an automatic rubber stamp for accessory dwelling units as part of this document.
This is probably for staff, I suppose. I noticed that there are detached ADUs in town currently that are probably grandfathered in. I don't know if those have been studied in any way, but they do exist.
Studied in what capacity?
Well, impact. I mean, are there complaints? Who knows? I don't know anything about it. I know they exist, though. I've seen them.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
Many of them from 80, 90 plus years ago.
Right.
Absolutely.
Okay. Anybody else? Back to you.
What is the plan for Royal Oak Golf Club? It is a valuable asset for the city. Will the city continue to support the golf course?
I mean, any changes to the golf course didn't come up in the process.
It wasn't a topic.
I think it might be referring to a discussion that was recently had at the Parks and Recreation Board. But again, the future land use map shows parks as parks and did not consider any potential changes.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Back to you.
The new master plan proposes new mini main streets inside or close to our neighborhoods. Do you believe all this new activity will take away from peaceful, tranquil, and safe neighborhoods?
No, but it's really important to point out that those commercial uses already exist today. That zoning already exists today. What the plan suggests is limiting the scale and sort of parking conditions, scale of businesses that would fill in, even types of businesses. So providing some additional limitation within those main streets, but also to shorten their footprint. So, today essentially on this map, there are the areas of light or darker purple that are concentrated. Presently, a lot of these roads in gold have much more commercial entitlement, and the goal is to try to reduce that over time. Now, not taking away property rights, but more so encouraging, this is a place that should be housing, and the commercial should be concentrated to 2 blocks of length, if not more. I mean, if not really more than 2 blocks of length in any given chunk, and that's because commercial works better when it is next to each other. You park one time and you can visit multiple locations. But it's really about the scale. To not enable the scale, it's not like a downtown right next to the neighborhood. But again, these already exist. They have generally, a lot of them have vacancies, and that has to do with that sort of long trickling effect of commercial sort of everywhere. But if you can concentrate them and have housing adjacent, then they can be viable, but they also need on-street parking and other facilities like sidewalk improvements and bike racks and street trees and other things in the public realm to support them. So it's not, I don't see it as a big imposition on the neighborhoods. In fact, I've lived near many commercial nodes like that within, say, a 5 to 10 minute walk, maybe a little bit further in some instances. And you don't find spillover traffic, you don't find spillover parking, but it was convenient as a place to go to the nearby corner store. So you have these nodes, they exist today. The goal is to reduce their footprint, but then enable their success.
All right. I don't know if any of the panelists, I would just say, speaking from personal experience, I live right by, in a little pie shape by Main Street, Rochester, and 13 Mile. And we have a busy place there. We got McDonald's, we got Dairy Queen, we got the Party Store, we got the 7-Eleven. They're right around the corner from me, but there's also empty spaces there. So, McDonald's is pretty new. They're not going anywhere for a long time. But in the future, 20 years from now, do we want to enable that area to have more mixed use? I think that's what we're talking about here. Those are the areas, even though it's not going to change tomorrow, those are the areas that we're looking at, what can we do with them? And yes, it's right by my house, and I think it's great.
Next question comes from Joe S. Are there plans for converting roads, such as Fifth Avenue, to more promenades? Are there other streets that are being considered to be promenades?
Yeah,
Promenades.
just Fifth at the moment, which is already a plan in place. And it's a pretty big there's a pretty big question in terms, and by promenade I think it's meant to be pedestrian only street, so non-vehicular street. There is in here a recommendation to study downtown more specifically. So we have some ideas. We said here's some examples of what might need to be addressed in the downtown area, because downtown could be more successful than it is right now. It needs a fresh look. There's lots of things that could be done. We gave a few examples. So whether or not you do have pedestrian-only streets would be something to investigate as part of that. Now, it's sort of a mixed bag, because a lot of places have tried that. They tried that in the 70s, and a lot of them failed. Not so much the same in Europe. They are pretty successful with pedestrian-only streets, but it's kind of hard to achieve. So you could study that as part of the downtown area study. You would need to have quite a lot of active ground floor sort of retail frontages, and you really wouldn't be served very, very well by ground floor office and other sorts of uses there. So at present, there's not another recommendation for pedestrian-only streets, mainly because they haven't necessarily proven out well in many instances. However, it could be studied in the downtown. I know there was a mention of that in an open-ended comment related to Maine. I don't think it's an appropriate use of Maine, but perhaps the thing with Fifth is it's a cross street between Maine and Washington, and that's a good potential opportunity. The train's a little bit, a very specific condition that makes that a little more difficult. But in the plan, no, there aren't any other recommendations for that, but that would be something to consider with the downtown master plan.
Okay. Any other comments? Back to you.
How does the draft master plan account for emerging trends such as an increase in working from home, ride sharings, and multi-modal or modal transit, train, bus, bike?
Well, the main goal there is to try to get more housing downtown. Because the sort of change in trends, you're not going to necessarily see a huge influx in the office market. But what you do lose in not having more housing downtown are sort of the sort of active businesses. We see a lot of change. There's a lot of comments about, well, hey, the downtown's becoming a place for more bars and restaurants for the region, and not really as much for folks that have been around historically. Adding housing in downtown can change that in terms of the composition of shops. Then you're able to actually support more varied businesses. So I think there was a call for, do you have access to more grocers? Do you have access to retail stores? Do you have access to convenience retail? And you're not going to get that if it's just a regional destination for entertainment. You're going to get that if people live there. And that's related to the working from home. But it's the same thing with neighborhood centers. A goal there is to support neighborhood activity. So if you are working from home, perhaps you want to work from the coffee shop that happens to be near your neighborhood as opposed to, alone in your house. I've worked from home for a long time. I understand how that works. The tertiary piece is about transit. So bus systems that stop every 2 blocks don't really work particularly well. You need is to have more concentrated stops. That is a sort of tertiary goal for having concentrated neighborhood centers and main streets, is that they can align with bus routes. So for instance, on 13 Mile, you would be much more efficient in stopping at those nodes as opposed to all of the time. Now that really depends on the transit system. Right now you just have the sort of system that is there today. There's the focus on Amtrak, its potential for the longer term future. That has been a sort of long-term goal. The same thing with Woodward, but you need sort of nodes of concentrated activity and housing to support transit. But you're pretty much there in most of the city. It's really about enhancing those areas, those activity centers, those nodes, because that's what supports transit ridership. But we don't have in here, plans for major changes to the bus system. Rather, land use to support that, should that system evolve in the future.
Commissioner Douglas.
Talk a little bit about the idea of the transit hub in downtown.
Yeah, so, that one, so you're rare because the downtown still has rail in it. You're not like some of the other neighboring cities that have had it and it's gone away. You have an Amtrak station. Amtrak's not the best in terms of commuter rail, but you do have a rail line that can service for future rail. So even to use Amtrak more regularly, or if there's another service that happens to be developed in the future, the fact that you have it in your downtown is a boon, because most other places don't. Even Birmingham got rid of their station. Troy's lands you in a shopping center. So it's not in your downtown. It's a very different situation. But as we've heard and observed, the area around the station is really dilapidated. people don't feel safe there. It could be something very, very different. So the goal in the plan is to work with Smart on their hub and recombine both the bus and the rail into a new facility instead of having that surface parking area, but an actual train station with an adjacent plaza and sort of park space behind it, but really not leaving sort of these dribbles of underutilized or undesigned spaces, but sort of combining all of those services into one and then enhancing that as a sort of civic center for the neighborhood surrounded by. I mean, there's a lot of retail uses that are directly adjacent, but because there's the rail line and this surface parking lot, it really kind of is deteriorated. This is really about taking that and flipping it to become a sort of new center for the downtown.
All right, back to you.
What were the demographics of the survey responses, the neighborhood meetings and the charrettes, as compared to the overall demographics of Royal Oak and/or the projected demographics for the life of this plan?
Yeah, they were. It was actually pretty interesting. I think if do you have the one from? I think we put them side to side in the master plan summary. No, it was in the summary of public input. But in any case, that document, which is on the website, shows, I believe it shows side by side the demographics of the city and the demographics of the survey. They're pretty similar, except the survey doesn't have as much representation from younger residents, which is typical. You don't really capture folks that are in high school or younger on surveys, so we don't have much in terms of results from that demographic. As for other demographics, it tends to track pretty closely. So I could try to look up what that is, but we did put it in the, I think it's called the catalog of public input, and that's on the website.
We can also follow up tomorrow.
Okay. Next question is, why haven't you scheduled at least 2 well-publicized town hall meetings to allow residents to find out what is being proposed?
I guess that's going to be for me or staff there. It's a process. We're figuring it out. The reason we're having a town hall here is because we had people come in and give us input and said, you should have a town hall. And so we said, okay, let's have a town hall. So it's a process. We don't know what we're going to do in the future because we're going to have this double meeting, 2-day meeting, and then we'll move on to the next step. Mr. Ellison.
Isn't it safe to say we just got the first draft of this? I mean, we haven't had anything to present up until this point. So as soon as we got the official first draft, we scheduled the town hall. So here we are.
Any other comments? All right, back to you.
Next question is, in terms of traffic lights identified for improvement, why was the light at 13 Mile and Alexander not identified? The crosswalk buttons are extremely difficult to press. The light change takes forever, and it typically stops a wave of traffic after allowing a large period of calm to pass while red.
Okay, we can take note of that.
Okay.
Yeah, we can take note of that.
Explain your refusal to conduct an economic impact, this was from Chuck Simchina. Explain your refusal to conduct an economic impact study regarding the changes in the plan to determine the effect on business and residential property values before it can be voted on.
All right. I guess I would say that we don't have a plan yet. I think we have an economic element to our team, right?
Oh, it's not totally in the scope. No, we don't have it. We do have the market analysis, and so the market analysis has been done. That is economic impact to some extent. It's not an economic impact analysis, which wasn't part of the scope, is extremely costly and is, essentially going to tell us that by adding housing and more commercial uses in our mixed-use centers, that they will produce more economic output. But it wasn't part of the scope and is extremely costly.
So let me just follow up with that. Is it typical for in a master plan process to follow up when you get to the point where you have a proposed plan to do an economic impact survey? Is that something that is part of the routine?
No,
Okay.
I haven't seen that anywhere.
Okay, thank you.
Next question comes from Janice Wagman. The development of an updated master plan is an ideal time to make the city all-inclusive, including the handicapped. While it does address items like transportation, sidewalks, and parks, the plan does not address items such as universal design, elevators, and accessible entrances in new developments. Further, the plan mentions parking 144 times, and not once does it address handicap parking. Given the deplorable lack of handicap parking in the downtown, the most egregious recommendation is the elimination of the majority of public surface parking in favor of more development. Unlike the parking structures, these lots are located closer to many downtown businesses, especially near Main Street. If we adapt your suggestions, where and how do you expect handicapped individuals to park so they can support and enjoy our downtown?
On the last one, Joseph, I have a question for you related to that, which is the sort of the implementation of the PROAG, the new requirements for handicap parking, like on each block face. Is that something that you all have looked into already?
Yeah, I'll probably take that one. But yeah, all of the city facilities in the downtown are meet ADA standards, handicap requirements, so all the decks, all the surface lots provide those. There is no standard for on-street handicap spaces. However, the DDA has just approved 2 new ones on 2nd Street in front of the post office, which I believe will be floating up to the city commission shortly. So we are adding more, but there is no standard for on-street ADA.
Well, there's a new one. It's the PROWAG.
But it's not required.
Yeah, it's not required. It's an optional standard, but we could include that. But that doesn't. That's part of it in terms of accessibility and visibility. We can note that for the update.
Next question is, how many more condos or apartments does downtown Royal Oak need? Do you take into consideration the builds around them before giving permission to knock down and rebuild?
I'm not sure that's a plan question, a master plan question. That's more of a planning commission question, unless somebody has a response to it.
I could invite that to be a question of public comment at a planning
Sure.
commission meeting. So next question is, could you please clarify how the draft master plan encourages actual bike infrastructure? Paint is not infrastructure, particularly, having a hard time reading that. As someone who would bike year-round, indeed, so in Chicago, I'm curious about this safety aspect. Sorry about my reading.
Yeah, I think that's related to some comments that we've also heard that that a greenway is useful but doesn't get us to necessarily all of the main streets, and a level of additional overlay that we need to look at in the revision, which is can we certainly get from the sort of greenway network and the existing bike ways and onto the sort of main streets and destinations. The other thing I'm just scanning through right now, but if we didn't address the bike accommodations and safety based on the roadway condition, that's something that we can address, which is basically right-sizing the need for having a buffered lane or a separated lane based on the speed of traffic for the roadway that it's along.
Okay, I'm going to follow up a question because I commute on my bike all the time, and I see in other cities, things in Ferndale, and I saw in Grand River, in Redford, and Detroit, they have these separated bike lanes. But these are new, okay? This isn't something that's been going on for 50 years. So I'm just wondering, do you planners, as these things get implemented, are you looking at the data, how people use them, the safety ramifications? I mean, these are relatively new.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest difficulty is snow clearance.
Is what?
Is snow clearance on the protected ones, because they tend to be, not quite the right size to run a plow down and everything. I mean, Colorado, we've been doing some work, and they're doing some up on the curb, sort of sidewalk adjacent bike lanes, and there's some dangerous aspects that have to do with intersection safety and so forth. So yeah, you're right. There's a lot of change in this in the recommendations and their applicability across the country. Now, from a safety standpoint, they are safer for the cyclist. But again, they have some other implications that are related to them that make them not as frequently used. So it has to do with intersections, turning, that sort of safety can be like a little bit more difficult. But I'd say the main thing is right sizing the type of facility for the speed of the road. So, once you get up to a road that's going 40 miles an hour, you can't have the lane just next to traffic, right? Without some sort of buffer or physical barrier. So I mean that's been proven out from a safety standpoint, and so the departments of transportation have all those standards associated. I think, personally, I think they allow for facilities next to traffic that's moving too fast. They should lower the sort of speed threshold for which they require a buffer or a separation between the lanes. But yeah, they've been adopted new, and it sort of depends. There's not one perfect standard, and especially for parking protected bike lanes. That's a much newer type, and some places have installed them successfully. Some places haven't seen a great success on that. So that's really something that needs to be, not so much an exact standard here, but something that's studied as you go from new project to new project, what actually is working today.
Yeah, I mean, I won't keep you on this but just like the crop circles, the traffic circles, they're relatively new, and these are really all experiments at this point. So I'm just talking about monitoring them, because I assume at some point some people are going to say we don't like this anymore, or other people say this is great, we're going to copy it, but we're not there yet, I don't think. That's just my comment there. All right, back to you.
This question comes from Ronnie Katayan. To state that single-family overlay districts are in the realm of zoning rather than future land use avoids the necessary discussion that must happen before the new master plan is approved. If this draft master plan is approved, give an example or two of how the city could maintain its very successful use of single-family overlay districts in a new zoning ordinance.
That sounds like a staff question.
I mean, I think it's simply that the future land use doesn't affect the overlay district, but
Correct.
Joseph?
That's correct. It wouldn't. I'm not sure what more to say.
Yeah, the future land use doesn't affect the overlay, and the overlay is still active, and the rule until the overlay is no longer the rule. That would be an action of council to remove the overlay. Maybe that's something that happens as part of some future zoning change. Maybe it's not. I think that's not determined, but the master plan doesn't have any effect on the use of the overlay.
Comments? Okay, back to you.
Why are you getting rid of property owners' rights, and why should property owners support this agenda?
I would say this. Well, actually, as I said before, zoning, I don't want to get into this, but zoning as a first instance is a considerable restriction on personal rights. It's your property, but the community is going to tell you what to do with it. And they're going to tell them what to do with it because we think it's better for the whole community, which has been proven out. Take single-family zoning for an example. That's really restrictive, but people like it, okay? Because they see a benefit to it. But it's a very restrictive law. So we're not taking, the right's already taken away, folks. The community has gotten together and decided we're going to have zoning. We're really tweaking the zoning or in the future by this plan. We're giving guidance for the future with this plan. That's what we're doing. If you have any other comments.
Next question. Am I understanding the draft master plan correctly that aside from its recommendation to pilot a program allowing ADUs, it does not advocate for changing the zoning for any of the neighborhood residential areas? If so, what percentage of the city's single-family housing is within the neighborhood residential areas?
I don't know exactly the percentage, but certainly in the high 90s of the existing housing is in the neighborhood residential areas. In terms of the zoning, yeah, and I think we've made the comment clearly enough, and we've shared a number of times. We're recommending that the zoning changes need to occur in places for growth. So downtown corridors, neighborhood commercial areas, industrial areas. We're saying that you may want to adjust zoning within neighborhoods for a variety of other reasons, not in order to increase housing, but to deal with issues of housing size, setbacks that aren't really applied correctly. So let me explain that one just really quickly. You don't need to touch the zoning in neighborhoods, but should you want to, generally what's occurred over time, and we studied this for like all of Wisconsin, and also in Michigan, when zoning was created, it was applied pretty broadly, and it doesn't necessarily fit the houses that it was applied to. So that zoning was applied at a time well after all the houses were built. And so you can look at the zoning and say, well, or you may have an opinion, well, why do the houses that are being built in my neighborhood have nothing to do with the houses that are there already? Well, it's because the zoning was applied really broadly to existing housing. So it's not imperative in this plan that you change that or address that issue, but it's an issue that maybe you want to address. But certainly what we want to address is the sort of growth in those areas that need to see growth to make that easy, so there is predictability, and we're dealing with supply, affordability, and the commercial success of the downtown and neighborhood centers.
All right, back to you.
Next question comes from Bill Harrison. Preserve surface parking for those who will not park in structures. The surface lot at 6th and Main serves the south end of downtown. The property purchase was justified by the May 2006 parking study. The surface lot at 6th and Center has the highest turnover of all of the parking lots. A portion of the old parking structure property on 3rd Street should include surface parking, as the master plan parking recommendations substantiated by a parking study. And that may have been in the form of a question.
Or in the prior, I think it's really part of the downtown plan that needs to be done. In the end, eventually the downtown shouldn't have any surface parking that's not on street. I mean, that's just downtowns don't work with surface parking lots. That erodes them. And so what we did identify here, though, which is true, that the south portion of downtown is not well served by the parking structures. So that is something that does need to be addressed at a point. So whether that's in the dual use of OCC structure, you can also see on this map, just in the southeast portion of town, that is not particularly well served by structured parking. So that's a consideration. Eventually, surface parking in downtown is not a good land use. Whether it's used today and useful today, perhaps. But for the most part, you have pretty good coverage in terms of your parking in the downtown area. Whether some survive or not, I think that's really part of the downtown plan.
All right, back to you.
Just to draw your attention to the time, it's 8:15, so we're 15 minutes into the final and third hour. There's no meal being served at the end of this. I'm just letting you know. The new master plan shows many projects eliminating precious old growth. Developers are allowed to clear cut, shouldn't be ever, property, months, sometimes years before a property is developed. Do you think this is a good practice, or should we make sure clear cutting needs to be less often and developers wait for groundbreaking before removing trees?
Yeah, I mean, some degree. What do you have in terms of tree preservation presently? I think we had discussed this a while
We
back.
have a tree ordinance,
Yeah.
and we've had it come before the planning commission a number of times. I don't remember any clear-cutting issues. Maybe I missed it, but
Do you think that's related? Maybe just somebody got a permit and a demolition permit, and then their financing fell through, or something like that, or is that common?
no. I think it's a pretty aggressive tree ordinance, but I guess that's all I can say. Woody?
Well, I guess I just want to say, I don't believe this is a master plan question or issue. It's sort of falls, to me, it falls into the basket of the post-master plan activities that come along with updating the ordinance and updating the rules to affect the master plan. I don't necessarily disagree with the comment or the question, but I just see this as not a master plan issue.
I mean, we do talk about trees and street trees and so forth, so we can certainly make mention of, you know, the importance of the tree ordinance and so forth in that section.
Okay. Back to you.
The new master plan promotes LED lighting everywhere, and especially street lighting, with $1 million from the ARPA fund spent on it. That million could go to many more uses. Number one, our street lights are just fine. And number two, read Sierra's Club light pollution policy. It's alarming how too much light affects the environment and our rights and our nights turning into days. Can you not add to this problem?
Well, I'd be happy to answer that one. The built environment requires, in my mind, to be beautiful and inviting, and it affects people and attracts people. Lighting has to be studied. You need people who know what they're doing. And our ordinance, current ordinance, if followed, would do a pretty good job. But the mention about the light pollution standards is apt, because you can meet the ordinance and still shoot light in the wrong spot. So I certainly don't know how we do this in the master plan, other than say we certainly advocate, or I certainly advocate, we should advocate for an aggressive encouragement of studied, artistic, professional, environmental lighting all over the city. I would love to see it. That's my comment.
Well, LED lighting saves money, and a fiscally responsible city government looks for ways to save money, to save the people's money, to spend it on the other things that they need. Our lighting ordinance does call for all lighting to be downward directed, so that we're not directing light up into the sky to affect both light pollution and birds and so forth. LED lighting is a good idea.
LED lighting is very flexible. And you know what? I went to Shrine the other night for the football game, and if you've been there for the night game, it's remarkable, because the field is lit up, but the neighbors aren't lit. The street's not lit. That's designed properly, so it stays on the field. It spills a little bit, but it's really amazing. LED lighting you can do a ton with. If anybody looked at the new train station upgrade, that was Gary Steffi Lighting who did that. I see you know what I'm talking about. That's how you light a building. You don't have to do it like that every time. But you need more than an ordinance. You need a desire to create these environments with light. That's what you need.
I mean, there are some issues with that you do need to sort of diffuse the luminaire when you use LEDs, because they can have a lot of glare, and I think we mentioned that. In the downtown, we had mentioned about dark sky fixtures, and that's something useful just in general to, which is part of the lighting ordinance, to shield from uplighting.
All right, I'm getting off my soapbox.
Well, I just want to add that, because it may not be known, that LED lighting, to your point, Trixana, has come a long way over the past several decades. Your ability to utilize LED lighting in very different ways is much greater today than it used to be. So when the term LED lighting is used, I think the first thing that pops in everyone's head is an operating room. That bright white light that is just very displeasing. The reality is it's not that way anymore. And to follow up on Commissioner Douglas's point, there's a real economic benefit to that conversion. So I think what Chair Casada said is very important in the sense that anything to do it well should be studied well. But the reality is LED lighting is a very viable option for us to be considering and has real economic benefits to it.
All right.
Why are you planning to place large developments on Rochester Road right after having made substantially less driving room by destroying lanes in an unwanted road diet?
Well, there aren't large
Go ahead.
developments. Yeah, there aren't large developments proposed on Rochester, but it also has capacity.
Let me ask this question because it really follows. You mentioned traffic problems, yet traffic problems have increased due to lane reductions. How do you justify that?
I don't think that it's.
Yeah, there's a statement there that traffic problems, I'm not sure I define that, accidents, congestion, I don't know if it's gotten worse or better. That's one of the things that we need to pay attention to. Whenever we make a change, we would expect that there would be an effect. So they need to be monitored, I would think, and we learn from it. But I live on Rochester Road, like I just said, Rochester and 13. I live right there. And anyways, I'm not complaining about it. It didn't seem to have a negative impact, but that's just me. That's my view.
Next question. If one builds a $150,000 ADU for their parents, will they be required to remove the ADU upon their parents' death to prevent rentals? This question comes from Bob Green.
Well, there aren't any rules for ADUs right now. Well, you have some today in terms of the caretakers. I don't know what the rules are around that. We haven't suggested any such limitation in terms of the considerations for the ADUs for piloting them, and you certainly wouldn't make somebody remove them.
Well, I think that is one of the issues, though, to even consider them, is that in the future, what happens. So, because I think Mr. Murphy mentioned that currently there is that restriction is on them, that they have to be. I don't have it memorized, but I think I've seen it.
Yes, it needs to be recorded at the county that it's
Okay.
for a family member.
Okay, so that's an issue. That's an issue for discussion, I would say. If there's ADUs, is it possible to restrict them forever just to a family member, or do we want that? I think that's, if you're going to do a pilot program, you're only going to do it after you look at that question and decide, before you do the pilot program, probably what direction you want to go in. That's a further discussion, I think, but it has to be had.
Yeah, well, I think it's also related to, to fears that may not be founded or play out in reality, where people have developed ADUs that have had ordinances that have been successful and have not had a significant negative impact on the surrounding neighborhood, which is pretty much most places. I mean, I think all places that I know of that have adopted ADU policies have not had, a huge influx of ADUs nor a significant impact on the surrounding neighborhoods.
All right, Woody.
I have a question for Mr. Murphy. So I know you said before that the current ordinance that would allow a resident to build an ADU for a senior family member is currently in place. It's rarely used. What does happen today in the event that a resident does build that unit, that family member does pass on? I know you mentioned it's recorded at the county. How is the use of that unit then enforced or I guess?
Since that ordinance provision was put in place in probably 2001, there may have been one or two that have come. I think there was one that came in front of you, received approval, and they never moved forward.
So we don't know the answer.
We really don't know the answer to that, and I don't know the legal standing that we would have anyways to make them, if they have a vested property right at that point, once they've obtained special land use approval and they've gotten a building permit and a final building permit, occupancy permit, then I really don't know the legal standing. We have to make someone not use that unit anymore because their loved one is no longer there.
All right, thank you.
All right, any others? Back to you.
The new master plan and commissioners keep saying we need affordable housing. Then why do you keep approving luxury apartments?
That's also a planning commission question, I think, but if you have any comment?
Well, I'm just that you don't really have a lot of control over how the market is responding to the demands for housing. You know, if somebody buys property, they have a right to develop property according to whatever the rules are, which may be a certain number of units, a certain size of building, whatever they may be, and you don't really have any control. Actually, the state doesn't allow you to have control over the price of the housing that they built.
All right, and I think we sort of addressed that before talking about the market forces, the market solution for housing.
Yeah, but you know, it's also reinforcing that the state of Michigan doesn't allow you to have any control over the price of housing.
All the public schools are experiencing declining number of students. Birth rate is dropping. How can you say that we will need more housing? Also, Royal Oak has 800 rental vacancies.
Well, I know schools, one issue for schools is not having a turnover in housing. So a few things there. One is that it's not correct to say that apartments don't end up having families with children that then are part of the school system. You know, that's false because they do. However, it's also important to provide housing that allows for some people who may want to downsize from their existing house and allow for a larger family to move in. And right now, a lot of people may be trapped. Maybe not everybody, but plenty are. So you actually need a diversity of different housing scales and types in order to support schools. What you see, you know, eventually, if you don't have that diversity, that churn, that movement of people from their homes to downsize or live with family or sort of support that wider life cycle, is you do have a decline in schools. And other cities around have seen that decline in schools. Work in plenty of other places that are similarly seeing that decline in schools. And one thing that's interesting in say a high growth area that we're working in, the school superintendent doesn't want to see just single families surrounding their schools. They're building new schools, and that's what's happening around them. And they know that that's a recipe for that school in a few decades dropping in enrollment and having to be sort of taken off the rolls, sold for whatever it's going to be. But that is a recipe for losing enrollment. So you actually need a balance of housing. You need more housing units, family growth in order to keep kids in the schools.
I'm just going to say that there's a push and pull here, because if I remember correctly, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's true that Oakland County, southeastern Michigan is losing population, but we're not, correct?
Yep.
We are an exception in that people want to come here. We're not losing population, and yet we have neighborhoods that are hard to afford for families, and so that's part of what personally I think the master plan should be thinking about, because that's the condition we have. We have a desirable city that people want to move to, that we need people and we need families, and we want to make it easier for them to get here because they want to be here. Like I want to be here, right? We all want to be here, so they do too.
So I'll direct this question to the chair. Why are you calling this a town hall meeting when there won't be a town hall give and take, and it is just written questions that you decide whether or not to read?
So interesting, we get all the time at the Planning Commission, the way the format is that we speak and the audience comes up for public comment and they speak, and lots and lots of times people will ask a question. And we say, okay, that's not the format. You give a presentation, that's the format. And so we're trying to get questions. We get that complaint a lot. You guys are not taking questions. This is a question session. We're trying to get as many of your questions as we can.
This question comes from Bill Harrison. The master plan recommends that a grocery store and hardware store will be added in downtown. Grocery stores have not survived in downtown over several years. 2 on Washington, 5th Street, Main Street, and 11 Mile Road. The hardware store on Main Street went out of business when the surface parking lot behind the store was lost to build the Etkin building.
Yeah, so the master plan doesn't say that that will be built, but that may be a desire that the city has for part of a redevelopment of public properties. It's something that is probably not going to come on its own from a market demand standpoint, but something that people have a need for in the area. Though, maybe they're fine going a little bit further north or further south. So that's sort of to be determined. In the master plan, it says related to the reuse of public properties. So should you offer, just like we said, is something that you could do for affordability. If you're looking to provide for some sorts of uses that aren't supported right now in the downtown, but maybe desirable, that's something that you could tie it to. But it's not something that is a direct outcome of the master plan, just something that's been identified as missing. Now, if you have more housing in downtown, then the ability to support a small grocer and hardware store might change from being something that requires some degree. It's not total subsidy, but to be able to be part of a public facility, perhaps it has a low rent in order to keep them in there. That would be the way you could do it today. In the future, with housing, maybe it can be supported. But the master plan just suggests that that is the way to achieve that gap that exists in the market, because the market's not going to achieve it on its own.
Back to you.
Why do the commissioners and DPZ say that a 3-story building and Airbnb next to my property will not affect its value?
We don't see anything about Airbnb. There is, we're not trying to put a lot of housing into neighborhoods, but if you actually look at the studies on property values, they do show an increase in property value when you have an increase in housing. Every study that has looked into that anywhere has found the same. Now, people will then go to crime, and you find on crime, the reality is that there's no difference in the rate of crime in any sort of higher intensity housing than lesser intensity housing. There happen to be more people there, and really on average you have a lower crime rate, but you have more people, so statistically, sure, you may have some crimes, but it's really mischaracterized in terms of that actually being the outcome of higher intensity. But what's proven out, like I said, is that property values actually increase when you have growth.
Other comments?
This question comes from Laura Harrison. If a current single-family district wants to maintain that title, can they? If not, why not?
I mean, I think we've addressed that we're not changing single-family districts.
I think it was addressed, yes.
You refer to the SEMCOG 2045 population forecast, which is flat. What were your assumptions about the evolution of family size? What number of households are you planning to?
I mean, I don't have that all off the top of my head. It's in the housing section, so we did discuss it. There's also I believe the demographic analysis is on the website. I mean, it's all there in the demographic analysis, so I'll double check. That should be on the website. And again, it's discussed in that section of the master plan.
Next question is, how can fire trucks and ambulances and police deliver timely emergency services to the public when you have cut lanes and have bike lanes?
Yeah, and I did talk about that as well. We're subject to international fire code and NFPA standards. There's not an impact on emergency services.
Back to you.
Do you plan to rezone city parks for multifamily developments? And there's a series of questions here, so we'll go through. I'm going to read all three and then you guys can respond. Do you plan to rezone city parks for multifamily developments? Is there enough parking spaces to accommodate future housing developments? When will the city address the gravel roads and pave them, such as Renford in Northwest Royal Oak?
The parks, no, there is no discussion of that. The parking, that there is capacity for parking. The gravel roads didn't come up. I mean, I've dealt with that in
There's a
Birmingham and
few.
elsewhere, but I'm saying that item hadn't come up yet.
No, I don't think it did.
Well, we do receive petitions from people who live on streets that are not paved. And when they bring us more than 50% of the frontage on the street, we will repave them. And the city's road budget currently has incentives to do that, and I can't tell you the exact numbers, but both the street that your building faces on and to some degree side streets also have incentives in our current millage to facilitate that.
Just to add to that, the ordinance has always been written that anytime you have an unimproved street in the city, the residents of the street have to pay for the first paving. That's always been the ordinance. Any street that's unimproved and now is paved was paid for by the residents who live on the street. That changed, as Shar said, there was an incentive program started by the city that they would help offset some of the costs. But still, if I'm correct, Shar, the ordinance still reads, if you live on an unimproved street, that is a street that has never been paved, not a street that's been paved and worn away, but a street that has never been paved. The residents of that street are responsible for the initial paving.
Yes.
And I am pretty aware of these streets, and I don't think there's any frontage on any of them. I think they're all side lots. They're all side lots. They're like four, they're all short streets between two other streets that are all four side lots. So I don't know the answer if we're going to get those paved.
You just said the population is dwindling, and that caused a need for more housing and a need for more parking and bike lanes. How so? We don't need new development to age in place. We need our neighborhoods preserved. Stop tearing down houses to build mansions. None of those are affordable housing.
Well, I mean, I think there's a few things in there. The last one relates to the discussion on whether or not you deal with any of the standards in zoning that have to do with neighborhoods in terms of what is built or what is not built. But the city doesn't really have any control over the cost of housing. That's completely outside of your control. The other pieces, there were a few, they just weren't related to each other.
Aging in place isn't dependent on development. Stop tearing down houses to build mansions. And the first part was, you said we have a dwindling population, and that caused a need for more housing and more parking and bike lanes. How so?
Those are also kind of disjointed questions, but
Yeah, I don't think we said that we have a dwindling population. I think we said the opposite, that we're the exception, and people want to live here. That's what my understanding is.
what was decreasing is the number of people per household, which is what requires more housing units for the same population. And so as the population increases, albeit not by a ton, it's not like a boom place, but it's increasing, unlike neighboring cities, and especially when you get the SEMCOG data, it's all sort of aggregated over the larger area and doesn't pick up as much on the actual growth in Royal Oak versus others and its potential. And it has the potential for growth if the housing was available, and in general it's not available, and so therefore you're not capitalizing on that potential. But then in addition, as I said, as the household size goes down, then you need more units for the same population. So even an increasing population means an ever increasing number of units. And we discussed the bike lanes and road diets.
Next question is, what zoning ordinances will be in place to protect owners of large, deep lots from a neighbor building too close to the property line or too high as to inhibit line of sight? This is from Carolyn Martz.
I would say, we're not dealing with zoning. However, there are a number of recommendations in here for when zoning is evaluated in the future, which is an important thing to do, especially in the areas, like we said, downtown corridors and so forth. Transition requirements are an important thing to consider, and that is how you deal with the adjacency between lower scale zone and a zone that allows for higher buildings. So that is something that we call out specifically, that you need to address transitions in building setback, in building height, and in the uses on a property. So that's something that should be addressed in the zoning and would be a part of dealing with corridors, especially. Now, in terms of an existing large lot and perhaps a single-family lot of a different type that's adjacent, that has to do more with does the zoning right now align properly with the buildings that are on the site? And again, if you don't deal with the zoning in single-family neighborhoods, then you sort of have the condition that you have today. If you want to deal with that zoning, then that may be a consideration. Are you seeing a good fit between the existing housing and what the zoning allows? Because it's not really aligned everywhere today. So again, most of the zoning change that we're talking about, which isn't part of this, but we're recommending, are for those corridors and downtowns, and we do clearly say transitions are a very important consideration in how that gets applied. And that's also a piece of the form-based code element too, which we were discussing, that allows you to focus very specifically on the transitions in a way that are, that you can more easily visualize. Like, well, what does it mean to transition? Well, here's what it looks like. That's why it's important to approach that. But otherwise, I think I've explained it in detail.
Oh, Commissioner Douglas.
Yeah, Matt said something earlier about the fact that zoning tended across America tended to get put in place after neighborhoods were built up, and we see this, I think, particularly in the south part of Royal Oak, where you had smaller lots, small houses, and the city established zoning codes in those neighborhoods back in the 90s, and those homes were close together. But they did allow a height of 30 feet. Well, that might have been the peak of a bungalow. But what's happened is that developers have taken those setbacks and those height allocations and built larger homes that don't require a zoning variance, that have narrow lot setbacks and maximize the full height of that 30 feet that is allowed. The plan talks about preserving neighborhood character, and I think there's absolutely time in the future for a discussion about neighborhood character and what we want those neighborhoods to look like, always bearing in mind the rights of the people who own the property.
Next question is, after looking at the renderings for the new master plan, it looks like the city and developers are doing whatever they want. I heard 300 people's voices were ignored about a development in their neighborhood that didn't fit. Will the new master plan, by its renderings, ignore the neighborhoods and go with the developer like shown in the draft?
I think the main point there is what we've said about the plan unit developments, and that we just need to agree on where growth is okay and the scale of that growth, and to ensure that that growth doesn't happen elsewhere. So it's not happening where people don't expect it to happen. In terms of the renderings, they're all on corridors, existing commercial areas, and downtown, and not within neighborhoods.
Next question. Your statement that you have to eliminate the single-family designation in the master plan to account for existing multifamily businesses in the near downtown neighborhoods, that was already settled 25 years ago with the overlay districts. Any response to the statement?
Yeah, just again, we're separating future land use from zoning, and zoning can still say single family all at once, but future land use isn't zoning, and this is a sort of problem that's kind of across the country, that eventually it sort of got hand in hand where future land use and zoning became the same. So we're decoupling that, but that doesn't mean, that's why the zoning plan specifically says, here's your designation, and here are the zones that are allowed in it. It's not making any change, it's just properly allocating what is future land use and what is zoning.
This question is from Chuck Semchina. How is there no cost study to determine the tax increases needed to pay for the master plan?
There's not tax increases needed to pay for the master plan?
Yeah, that would have to be a city commission question, I think.
Well, it's not that the master plan isn't suggesting anything related to tax increases. You know, things go into city budgets. City has goals about what they do on a yearly basis with the money they have, and that's how they choose to budget and put in their capital improvement plan together. You know, whether that's facilities, whether that's parks, whether that's roads, all sorts of services. That's an annual budgetary thing and not part of the master plan.
I mean, the master plan is dealing with private property as well as the public property and whatever, you know, that's not the same thing, but anybody else? Okay.
Just to Gary, I'm sorry.
Yes.
The question could be kind of misleading, I think. There's no tax increase to pay for the master plan. The master plan is what these gentlemen are doing right here, which is already budgeted and already approved for. And if it's pay for the master plan, which is the document you're producing, then that's already budgeted and paid for. Now, implementing the master plan and doing that stuff has nothing to do with raising taxes. It's going to go back to whatever falls out in the master plan process or in the developers or the homeowners or the property owners or whatever building within the master plan. That's when the money expenditure starts coming in. And there's nothing to me to indicate that we're going to have a tax increase to accomplish allowing people to build what they want to build on their property. It's just another question to raise doubt. It's sort of like who's eating cats, you know, and it's just a comparison. It's a question that has no.
All right, folks.
Okay, we're going.
We'll move on.
So the next
But I know also, like on the public improvement side, you know, I talked to Joseph and he's like all about finding the federal grants for this or that or the other thing. So, you know, there's many ways to pay for different infrastructure upgrades and so forth that aren't necessarily, you know, incumbent on tax. So it's a balance between what the city decides to do from a budgetary standpoint and goals on a yearly basis, and what, you know, can be eked out of various grant programs at the federal, state, and county level.
I'll chime in one more thing. Every single year, Planning Commission reviews and holds a public hearing on the capital improvement plan, which identifies public improvements for the future and potential funding sources. This is stuff that we look at every year.
The city spends money for tree saplings in our neighborhoods. Should the new master plan be allocating part of that money to save valuable mature trees by trimming and disease prevention?
I mean, we don't allocate anything, but we do point out the need to diversify the trees. We hadn't heard yet about any major issues on trimming and disease prevention, but you know, if you all have heard much about that or that think the program needs bolstering or a discussion, I mean, trees and preserving trees is very critical, and preserving trees for the longevity of the city is very critical. So if that's something that we should touch on, great. Yeah, Woody?
Well, I just want to state that, you know, the maintenance and preservation of trees currently is part of the DPS purview. And if there is a resident that has a concern about a street tree that may be in their strip, there are arborists on staff at DPS that you can call that will absolutely come out and take a look and advise you as the resident and the owner of that tree what might happen with it. So I think the question was around, should we allocate resources for tree preservation? And I would say that they already are being allocated.
And, okay, I don't want to take too long with this, but we saw in the storm just about a week ago where the trees over in Red Run Park, a couple of huge trees fell down one of them fell down onto the tennis court. Now, I don't know if that was a diseased tree or what, but thank goodness nobody was in the way. But obviously it's something that probably we need to put some attention on.
You seem to be promoting a city plan for young people who've not provided the tax revenue. It's a statement, not a question. Anybody want to respond?
I don't have a response. Does anybody else?
Not a question.
Yeah.
It's not a question.
You seem to be promoting a city plan for young people who have not provided the tax revenue.
Let me try to address that. the young people that haven't generated taxes, they're the future. We're not building this master plan for us. I'm going to be checking out here probably 15, 20 years, and by the time we implement some of these things, it's the young people. And I've had this discussion with many people. They're not savvy enough right now, a lot of them, to pay attention because they're involved in their day-to-day life today. But when you're looking for the future, our goal again is always to make incentives for people to stay in our community and raise their family. That is the future of our community. If we can't keep those people in our community, then we're just going to go away. But the master plan right now is for the future. It's not for today. If you're my age, I'm 72 years old, and you're looking at some of these plans we're talking about, this stuff isn't going to happen this week or next year or 2 years. If anything happens, a lot of us will have already checked out. So I'm looking at this as making sure that we're leaving, our legacy is leaving a community that's going to be attractive to the young families, the young people today when they get to be in their 40s and 50s. And they still love the community as much as we do, and they can pass that on to their children. So.
And also really making strides in improving the activity, housing, business in downtown, on Woodward, in neighborhood centers, elsewhere in the community, all are things that contribute to the tax base. They don't detract from the tax base. Significantly, I know that in Birmingham, their downtown is a huge contributor to the tax base there, much more so than the housing within neighborhoods. And that, that is a really critical, important consideration here for how the city can fund itself and have more money for public services, parks, and, really any of the programs that people are looking for. You need to have viable, active, and successful places like your downtown and other places that could be nearly as successful, but not as intensive in scale, to be able to support the tax base. So it's very important to do so and attract future residents.
And I guess I will pop off here. I want everybody to check out page 45 with the age distribution, the population of Royal Oak. I think I looked at this before, and I think more than half the population is under 39 years old. Okay, the 65 and up, me and Jim's bracket there. 65 and up, not a very big bracket. The people this plan is for is that spike. The young people, 24 to 39, 20 to 39. I think a lot of them are homeowners. They may not own the biggest homes, but I see young people at the parks. I see young people at their strollers. I think those are the people this plan is for.
Well, related to that earlier question on the surveys, the lower end of the spectrum is underrepresented, and the higher end of the spectrum is a little overrepresented, but the middle was roughly equal to the current distribution.
One last quick comment, and I can wrap this up. Born and raised in this community. I've lived here 72 years, my entire life. And during the 50s and 60s, when I was a young lad not paying taxes, I'm grateful for the decisions that the elected body made at that time to invest in the city that I was going to stay in and live in. And they continue to do that, and then we continue to do that now. And as we're in that upper age bracket, I want to leave the legacy that somebody left for me, that I can love this community as much as most of the people in this room do, and stay here and keep it lively, keep it solvent. Thank you.
Okay, back to you.
Could the city ameliorate parking concerns by adopting transferable parking permit deeds for existing residents, such that current residents would get guaranteed parking access and be able to sell their parking rights if they do not need them, and parking demand is high?
I'm not familiar with that concept, but maybe you are.
I mean, the only concept that is typically used, there's a few things, but is unbundled parking, which typically has to do with downtown areas or other urban areas where parking is not necessarily a part of the unit but sold separately from the unit, and that's usually to encourage not overbuilding parking for them. I mean, this is talking about something completely different that I'm not familiar with. The other, which nobody's really touched on is whether or not there are places that need permit systems and so forth, but you don't have a lot of, you don't have a hugely significant usage of your on-street parking adjacent to downtown or other areas besides, Woodward spillover. So it's not so much an issue there. So I'm not entirely sure where this would be applicable.
Okay, we'll have to, back to you.
Why are the citizens not allowed to vote on this?
That, I'll take a shot at that, but maybe our city commissioner would like to chime in. This is part of the process is the purview of the planning commission. We're the ones who put together the proposed master plan and then send it on to the city commission, who are the elected representatives who were elected by the people to do exactly their job, which is to approve the master plan when we send it to them. But this part is a very interactive part where we're going to develop this proposed master plan.
So we receive many forms of input from the people of Royal Oak. I, as an elected official, we on the city commission, the input we get from our voters is every 2 years or every 4 years when we're elected to represent their interests, your interests. But we still spend substantial time, money, and effort to make sure we are listening to those citizens, and I think this master plan process is a sterling example of how we have spent that time, money, and attention to listen to people. When you look at the results of the initial neighborhood meetings, the charrettes, the first quantitative survey, the second quantitative survey, thousands, literally thousands of opinions have been registered regarding this plan, and the document reflects those opinions, those desires, those wishes as articulated by our planning consultants. It is the job, it is our duty, our responsibility as city commissioners to listen to that input and make decisions on behalf of the people, and that is what we will do when this process is completed months from now.
So if everybody pays attention, it's 8:58, so this will be the last question. Will you read all of the cards? Read this one out loud and answer the question. Joseph?
We were able to get through a substantial number of questions tonight. And I think what we can do is work with Matt and his team to identify all those on the website that were verbal answers were provided at tonight's meeting. The remaining cards, we can identify those separately as other outstanding questions on the website. An extreme number of this large stack that you see over here are duplicative or worded in some other fashion. Others are statements, not actual questions. Some have nothing to do at all with the document itself or anything addressed in the document. But we absolutely will add those to the process as we move forward.
Okay, and of course, we're going to meet tomorrow night. I have one question I'm surprised we didn't get, so I want to put it on the record. There was a question about the, what's this one called? South of Sherman, north of 11 Mile, there is a future land use, mixed use corridor designation. That's something that was asked to me. So Matt, tomorrow maybe we can talk about that. I'm familiar with that area, and there was a question about that. I'm surprised we didn't get it, but we'll talk about it tomorrow.
Okay.
All right. Good?
It's appropriate to have a motion to adjourn.
All right, folks, thank you very much.
Until
We're at the
tomorrow.
end of the 3 hours. Is there a motion among the commissioners to adjourn the meeting?
Chair, I'd like to move to adjourn the meeting.
All right, is there a second? Second by Commissioner Douglas. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Very good. Thanks, everyone.